So we're really excited to have this session on the role of deltas in regulating biogeochemical cycles. The history of OCB, this is the first time that we've had this topic as a plenary, and so we're excited to pull in a new community and introduce them to each other, all of us to each other. So despite their relatively small aerial extent, deltas are major centers of primary production and biogeochemical processing and transformation. And in this session, we will explore various aspects of deltas, from physical processes and biogeochemical cycles to sea level rise and mangroves, and we'll discuss measurements and modelings and different tools that we use to study deltas. Go for it. And I'll pass it on to Shaily for the rest of the introduction.
So this is a figure of the global distribution of population in deltaic area. And I'm going to go through these slides quickly so that we can start. We're a little over time. About 340 million people live along deltas, but mostly between 9 and 36 degrees north. Deltas or rivers supply most of your, or a large portion of your freshwater and sediment flux has to actually pass through a delta before it can make it into the open ocean. So you can see, I don't know if my cursor, oh here, the Amazon right here, the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna system here, the Congo, and the size of the circles is related to the size of your flux. And so the approach that we took with this session is to probe both the geophysical and the biogeochemical processes and transformations that can occur in a deltaic system. And so the overarching question that we have is, what is the impact of deltas on fluxes and processes in the global ocean? You know, this nutrient supply supports a lot of fisheries. We have a lot of populations that live along deltas, but they're also experiencing sea level rise, cyclone storms. So we're also wanting to probe like what happens here within the delta and then how that impacts these fluxes out into the open ocean. So we're going to start with an overview of the BECS working group and then an overview of deltas in general, the biogeochemical cycling in deltas. We're going to then focus on geophysical processes in the morning before we take a break for lunch. And then we're going to focus on biogeochemical and ecosystem processes before we have our panel discussion. So I'm going to hand it over to Cristina Schultz, and she's going to be talking about the BECS working group, which is very relevant to our topic.
So a lot of the talks we've had earlier during the workshop really set the stage for us to talk about the BECS working group. So this is benthic ecosystem and carbon synthesis. And basically, we're just worried about representation of benthic processes and sediment processes in the global ocean. So our organizing committee, this is a working group that's led by me and Jessica Liu, and these are our other co-conspirators here, Wally Fulweiler at Boston University, Matt Long at HUI. Please be aware there are two Matt Longs. This is not seaworthy Matt Long, this is HUI's Matt Long. Colleen Patrick at Scripps, Jeremy Testa at University of Maryland, and Damian Brady at University of Maine. So this working group came from a discussion we started having at GFDL on the lack of representation of sediment and benthic processes in models. So that's a major gap on our understanding of how coastal ocean works and on global ocean in general. So now we're talking about using the oceans to capture carbon, but if we don't understand what's happening in the sediments, what's happening in the benthos, how much of it is actually going to stay there, what are the transfers between land and ocean, coastal ocean and open ocean, this is not going to be properly represented. So there are many difficulties with building a model. So there's the influence of ecosystems in most of the models that are used is neglected. The representation of diagenetic processes in Earth system models and most of the biogeochemical models is very simplistic. And there's a huge difficulty integrating across spatial and temporal scales. So we did a review of all the models there, not all, but hopefully most of them, all the models that are available, and we came up with this beautiful idea of everything that we should include to have something that is of equal complexity to the biogeochemical models that we have. And then we went to look for data that we could use to both inform and validate the model. And that's where things got even more complicated. There's not a lot of data around there. So we're building on previous work that has been done. So we went back to the CCAR, so Coastal Carbon Synthesis, that went from 2008 to 2016. And that was a partnership between the U.S. Carbon Cycle Program, the NACP and OCB. And they did a lot of literature review from modeling and data synthesis in different regions in the U.S. to try to figure out all these carbon fluxes and how important or how big they are in the different regions. So this is a figure from Ray Najar's synthesis from 2018, just showing all the fluxes that they were trying to quantify from rivers to the open ocean. And so this is for the East Coast. And for the East Coast, the first synthesis published in 2012, the conclusion was that sediment fluxes were the least well quantified. And then in 2018, they had a better idea of how it worked, but the conclusion being that it's on the East Coast, it's on the lower end of the global averages, but there was a lot of spatial variability that they're like, the data is very different. That probably reflects true spatial variability that we're not able to fully understand yet. The good news is that there have been many different data syntheses in the past few years. So here are some of the data synthesis that we started looking at. So Stratman et al. That looks at benthic data, so macrobenthos, meiobenthos. Boynton et al. Looking at oxygen and nutrients, Jorgensen at total oxygen uptake, and Hayes at total organic carbon flux. And you can see that some of them, there's still a lot of the world oceans that there's basically no data. And so the figure I showed on the previous slide for the US East Coast, that is one of the best sampled areas in the world. So one of the data sets that I didn't add here was it that looks at sediment characteristics, so bioturbation and mixing of the sediments. Like 30% of the data is in the East Coast, and we still have a hard time understanding what's happening. So Boynton et al. Points that only like 7% of the data sets sample for 3 or more years, and only 3% for 6 or more years. So there's not a lot of long data sets that we can use to inform temporal variability as well. So just to talk about what we want to do. So we're hosting webinars every 2 months. So anything benthic sediment related, fluxes, boundary layer dynamics, ecosystem techniques, human interactions. We accept applications for talks. You can find that on our website, which is also on the OCB website. We're going to host special sessions at large conferences. So the next one's coming up at AGU. And the idea is to get, if you have data, if you know of data that's lying around, hasn't been published, please, this is an incentive to go ahead and make people know about your data. We have a couple workshops planned. So we need to define research priorities, establish definition and variable names, and get opinions from stakeholders. There is a big divide between the people doing true coastal oceanography and oceanographers. There's a lot of different interpretations of what coastal means, for example. And it's really hard to, talk and define what needs to be done unless we all get together and talk about it and agree on some terms. And then we're going to have a second workshop to identify methods needed to improve the quantification of these processes and their representation in Earth system models and ocean models in general. We really want to get representation across geographical locations and career stages. So please don't be shy. If you're a student, a postdoc, please apply for these talks. We're welcoming everyone's opinion on this. And if you are interested in collaborating in any capacity, please come talk to us. We are also hiring postdocs and grad students for both data synthesis and modeling. So yeah, welcome any participation from anyone.
So I'll bring up our first session speaker, Bob Aller, giving a talk on deltas as dynamic, diagenetic, and biogeochemical cycling systems.
So I'm going to try to give you a feeling for what goes on in deltas, sort of some of the principles. I'm not going to try to overwhelm you with lots of detail and tremendous number of pore water profiles and so on. So if you want some of that, I'm perfectly willing to fill in the dots later. And like any scientific endeavor, everything I'm talking about represents collaborations over the years with many people who have contributed to what I'm going to be talking about. In fact, that's one of the joys, I think, as you all already know, of doing science. And in my own case, I started working on deltaic systems back in 1980 in the East China Sea in the Changjiang Delta. And it's quite different now than it was then, and I'll refer to some of that. I'm not going to speak a lot about that particular system. You've already heard something about it, but it really is an adventure to work on deltas, and it's inherently international because you go to people's countries and you work in their territories and you interact with them. So it's natural, broader impacts and outreach. So as many of you know already, Nina mentioned it the other day, I think yesterday, deltas are a primary, in fact, coastal marginal seas, the coastal ocean are the primary storage sites for carbon, and that draws us to them in a natural way. And deltas in particular, as you're going to hear, account for roughly 50% of all the carbon storage in the ocean. We've known this for a long time. The number changes a little bit from year to year, but basically that's the story. Now, you already saw, because Shaily showed you a different formulation of this, what the input patterns of sediment to the oceans are. And you can see they're very heterogeneous, and there's a few regions that dominate over others. And in particular, the width of those arrows is proportional to the, essentially, the megatons of carbon coming out of different regions of the continents and entering the oceans. And you can see that Southeast Asia and Oceania clearly dominate, and the low latitudes dominate. So this material that's coming from the continents mixes with seawater, and as I'm going to show you, with marine organic matter, and moves on into the ocean and generates new products, as you're going to see. So it's not all those sort of big arrows. You can start to look at individual systems, and here you can see a little bit more about Oceania here. And one of the important aspects of this is that rivers drain different drainage basins. They have different properties. They deliver different kinds of material depending on what the nature of the drainage basin is. And in fact, there's a difference between active and passive margins on the average. So for example, in cross-section here, you can see active margins on the left, passive margins on the right. This is idealized, obviously, but the transit time from an active margin into the sea is very short, usually a high yield type of drainage basin, and the kind of carbon that enters the sea from this system tends to be older on the average, if you look at the carbon-14, and unreactive compared to what we see on passive margins, where the, let's see if I can do this without really screwing it up. You don't have to sing anything like you did as a kid when the ball bounced on the cartoon, but the material sits here in drainage basins, gets altered, enters the sea. Part of it's been replaced with newer material. It's still aged on the average relative to fresh plankton, but it's been replaced from what it was in terms of petrogenic carbon. So there's an inherent asymmetry between what enters the ocean depending on the drainage basin. And this is another way of showing that. Carbon-14 age of material delivered by different rivers. Here's, oops, my goodness gracious. Carbon-14 age here in formation age here, or carbon-14 and del-14C units if you prefer that. So the passive margins tend to deliver fresher material from the continents than the more active margins with the high yield drainage basins. So there's an asymmetry in the kind of material entering the oceans from the land, and there's also differences in the kind of inorganic phases associated with this material. So for example, in tropical drainage basins, you tend to get an enrichment of iron oxide on the material. Here's a lateritic regolith in French Guiana, and you also you see an enrichment here. The height of these bars is proportional to the amount of reactive iron in the sediment, and tropical systems like the Amazon or the Gulf of Papua in Oceania tend to have enrichments of reactive iron compared to places like the Eel River on the west coast of the U.S. or the Gulf of Mexico. Makes a big difference. Now, Jessica told me you better tell everybody what diagenesis is. So here's a schematic diagram of that. Here, Jesus, stop it. That's just to see if you wake up. And I'm going to use this classic methodology so I don't screw up so much. Here's the sediment-water interface, overlying water. You're looking at depth in the sediment. Organic matter comes in at the top. It undergoes remineralization. You're left with a certain amount that's stored, and it goes through a series of reaction paths, depending on the redox conditions and the availability of reactants. And you produce a whole bunch, a slew of different inorganic mineral products that build up and are buried. And you also return a certain degree, a certain fraction of the products of these reactions back to the water column. Now, I'm going to idealize some of the different regimes that occur in the coastal ocean associated with subaqueous delta systems in this way, using a cliniform delta form here. So here's the coast. There's your mangroves. There are sand deposits that characterize often the intercoastal part of these systems. There's often a broad plain here, which I'll refer to as a topset. Other speakers will refer to this as a delta plain. So don't get confused by the terminology. Just think about the function of these different regions. These are typically very energetic places, and it makes all the difference in the world. They underlie oxygenated water, typically, and they often have low productivity in the water column because it's turbid, because of resuspension, and also because of riverine particulates. Offshore of this part of the delta, you typically get very high productivity, marine productivity, and you also get storage sites in what's called the foreset. This tends to be bioturbated. This tends to be physically controlled. And I've shown little schematics of how the sediment might look to you if you looked at it. It's a mobile system here with oxidized sediment being remobilized by physical conditions over huge expanses. And here we have bioturbated sediment. And here we have your permeable sands, and then your mangroves in this system, or salt marshes in others. I'll come back to this if I have time. And this is for real. This is the Gulf of Papua. This is not just pretend. So the shoreline's over here, way over here actually, about 20 meters of water depth. So this is all topset going on to the inshore. This is your foreset of the cliniform and your bottom set out here. It's not just imagination. These are actual morphologies you see. Now looking down and emphasizing the function here of this on this kind of system, you can see this is, again, now you're looking, this is a shoreline, mangrove shoreline. This is river inputs. This is sandy regions. This is this top set, which I refer to, as you'll see in a minute, as a carbon incinerator and a refluxing part of the system. This is a storage region of the system. And then as you go on into the ocean, this whole system is prograding, typically nowadays anyway, over the outer shelf part. So I'll talk about the function of each of these parts, emphasizing this because it's absolutely critical to cycling in deltaic systems. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize, if I forget to say it later, we've seen multiple diagrams that show arrows going from the land to the sea, the shoreline to the sea, the sides to the sea. They're all unidirectional. That's just not true. I don't know why people keep showing those diagrams, because there's a tremendous backward flow of material into these systems from offshore and into this processor in the delta. I mean, it's not that serious a problem, but I think I'll show you why it does cause problems. So one of the parts of these systems we really don't understand very well at all are the role of sands. And I have not much to say about it other than we don't understand it. We need a lot more work about it. These are flow-through systems. This is in the Gulf of Papua. The Parari River is off in the distance there. And these sands act as traps for reactive particles. They tend to undergo diagenetic changes in them and produce a flux of solutes. It's difficult to measure. One of the ways we've been experimenting with this is to use accumulators to measure what's actually released from the sediment as a function of different conditions. And in this case, we've imposed bioirrigation activity into the sand. And what you can see just qualitatively, which is all I want to say right now, is that when you connect these to sediment that's being irrigated or advected by physical means, there's a lot of iron that gets out of that sediment, and you trap it. You can trap it in this simple system that we've designed and measure it directly. It's extremely difficult to measure this flux and interaction otherwise. But the main point I want to make is sands are understudied. They're basically reactive particle capture areas, and they release the products of those reactions to the overlying water, and we really don't have good measurements of those releases. Now, I mentioned this part of these diagenetic regimes, the mobile mud belt, the oxidized system, and this shows you off the Amazon River here. Here's the mouth of the Amazon on the equator, and material comes out and is deposited here, reworked in this area. But this area here, characterized by these conditions, is about 50,000 square kilometers. So it's not trivial, okay? And it lacks macrofaunal communities to any degree. It's controlled, as I'll show you in a minute, by bacteria. So qualitatively, this is the way it looks. Here's the depth in this case. The thickness of reworked mud can be 1, 2, 3 meters in thickness. In many systems, it's just 50 centimeters or 20 centimeters. It's reworked tidally or seasonally, depending on the physical conditions. And you maintain a system that's in a state of iron reduction. It's trapped there because of the physical reworking that reoxidizes the sediment continuously. So if you went in here and measured the pore water, which I'm not going to show you in this talk, it's about 1 million times overlying seawater values in concentration. And it's always being reworked, and the iron is being released to the water column as a result. So this is what I meant by the bacteria macrofaunal abundances. These columns here show you the biomass of bacteria in different parts of the Amazon or the Gulf of Papua, topset regions. And you can just see the red bars are a heck of a lot higher than the blue ones, and that's microbial biomass. There's hardly any macrofaunal biomass because of the disturbance. You go off here, off our coast right here, there's a lot of macrofauna. Bioturbation plays a much greater role in controlling the composition of the sediment and the fluxes. Now, one of the things about deltas is not, for example, let's take the Mekong here. You bring in the sediment. I showed you the kind of magnitudes we're talking about. It comes into the ocean. Does it just accumulate off the mouth of the river? No. Part of it goes along shore and starts to control conditions along the shoreline. And it varies from place to place. This is from Paul Liu and others. Summarized some of this from a few years ago. And you can see that in some cases, 40% of the material brought by the river that doesn't end up here, it goes along the shoreline. So deltas impact regions laterally that are much greater than just where the river enters the ocean. And I'll show you one of the consequences of that in a minute. So this is a sort of a conceptualization, if you will, of the Amazon Delta. At this end, here's the Amazon River bringing in water and sediment. A lot of it accumulates in a complicated pattern. I just indicated here by a delta symbol. And so we have the top sets here that I mentioned, and your storage sites out here, and your offshore sands out here. And then you drop into the deep sea farther offshore. And there's a coastal region that represents this extent, lateral extent of the delta, that it goes along the Guyana coastline and ends up over in the Orinoco River Delta here. So there's two deltas that are coupled together with a highly energetic coastline. And I just, I like the quote from Thoreau that it's not what you look at, it's what you see. And so what I see is a band of mobile mud moving along the coast. And in this case, it's in the form of a series of mud banks. The inner part of the mud bank stabilized by mangroves. Each of the mud banks is about 30 kilometers offshore in extent and about 60 kilometers long. There's about 25 of them along this 1,600-kilometer coastline, but it's very dynamic. And again, look at the arrow I put here. There's inshore transport of material from the ocean to the system. It's processed here and then sent back in a different form, altered. That's my schematic diagram. This is the way it might look to you if you were to look from a height on one of these mud banks. And so we're talking about tens of kilometers offshore here of exposed mud at low tide. If you were to try to stand in this, which you can, you will sink up to about here, typically speaking. And if you wiggle a little bit, you'll go up to here. And so it can be dangerous, and you need to be careful. And this is this inner band I refer to that's stabilized by mangroves. And so the mud propagates along this coast at about several kilometers a year. And there's always accretion and destruction and erosion and remobilization and so forth. And so when the mobile mud is stabilized, mangroves quickly come in, pioneer mangroves, and after about 6 months, they're half a meter or meter high. After a couple of years, they're a few meters high, and after a few years or more, they can become 30 meters high with a major mangrove forest. So it's a stabilization time, and then it all goes away. It all gets eroded and injected back into the ocean and moved down the coast. And all this terrestrial carbon in mangrove trees gets eroded and sent as debris just offshore, a few hundred meters. And the amazing thing is, if you go into the pore water, you can't see much evidence at all for terrestrial carbon. The pore water remineralization patterns show you that the system is dominated by marine carbon. I'm running out of time, but let me just say, if you go along the coastline in the Amazon, you start at the Amazon River. This is a measure of the organic carbon per surface area, what's called loading on the particles, carbon loading. The Amazon River starts here. Part of that material moves laterally along the coastline. As it does, it starts to lose carbon. Loading of the carbon's lost. By the time you get to French Guiana, it's much lower than that average on the particles. And in this particular mixing plot, it's shown here, the slope of this plot relative to carbon isotopic composition of the carbon that's lost show you that it's terrestrial carbon that's lost. So you lose terrestrial carbon in the net sense, but I'm going to show you that you actually remineralize marine carbon along the way. So you're entraining marine carbon. Here's a measure of the entrainment of offshore carbon. That record is stored in the sediment in the form of lead-210 inventories. We've known this for a long time. If you look at the lead-210 values in the sediment, in the inventories, you can see huge inventories of lead-210 in the offshore of the Amazon, and it's going onshore, okay? So there's an upwelling of lead-210 rich water offshore, comes onto the shelf, laps onto the shelf, is scavenged, and it leaves this record of how much. And what Smoke and DeMaster and others showed is about 5 times to 10 times the volume of water that the Amazon River brings in upwells. So upwelling is more important than the river. Same thing happens in the Gulf of Papua. Here's depth, bathymetric depth, lead-210 inventory. As you start to go up onto the cliniform, you scavenge out lead. The record of how much onshore movement there is. And so, a record of all this is here. You get extensive cross-shelf exchange. So all this is the Amazon plume with a real color image. Here you can see that nice green phytoplankton-rich water. Here are eddies coming inshore, bringing in some of this stuff. And there's a lot coming in underneath that you can't see, heading toward the shore, bringing everything that's been produced offshore back to the inshore, back to that top set region. Okay, and this goes all along the coast. Here's the mouth of the Amazon. Go up here, Cabo Orange, so French Guiana is here, and these mud waves, you can see them, mud banks, you can see them expressed here, and all the phytoplankton activity here that's associated all along the way with benthic remineralization. And there's a plume, as you well know from other studies. There's the retroflexion of the so-called Amazon plume. Here's the Amazon River again. But I would tell you, that's not the river plume. That's a totally modified water by interaction with the mud all along the way. Now, I know I just have 30 seconds. I'll try to make a couple more points here. One of the things we look at in sediments during diagenesis, what is driving the diagenesis? And one of the things you see in these systems, if you plot carbon-14 age of the carbon in a particular pool versus carbon-13 of that pool, sediments tend to lie here. In all sorts of different systems, they tend to lie dominated by terrestrial carbon, so it's light on the C13 scale, and they tend to be rather old, a few thousand years old on the average. On the other hand, if you look at the pore water CO2, what the heck is being remineralized? What you see is it's marine carbon, and it's young. There's always a selective oxidation. And so to summarize this, and I'm going to skip the last couple slides, but since we saw, Nina showed a plot the other day that shows that when you increase accumulation, the percent of the carbon that is deposited that's actually stored goes up. Except when you get to these deltaic systems, which are the highest accumulation rates on Earth in these deltaic systems. All of a sudden, you get extreme variability in how much is stored relative to how much hits the surface. Okay? And so these deltaic fluidized regions that I've been described lie down here. They're like the deep sea in terms of their storage efficiency. Okay? Very little is stored. On the other hand, if you go to the Eel River systems or places in like the Waipoua in New Zealand that drain active margins, you see huge storage efficiencies. So it's one of these answers to the questions where we would say, it depends. I lied. I'm going to do this one. Sorry about that. So here's the loading you see in different systems in different regions. These mobile topset deltaic regions have very low carbon loading. They still have a little bit of terrestrial carbon, a little bit of marine carbon, which is driving the diagenetic system, and actually far and away it's driving it. So that incorporation, that shoreward movement is really, really important. But these are incinerating zones on Earth. Here's what rivers bring in. Here's what the deltas generate. We go off the deltas. They get plastered again with marine carbon, reloaded, move into the deep sea, move into the Central Pacific, just like the Amazon Delta. The deep Pacific is just like the Amazon Delta in this regard. And this has recently been summarized in this paper, which you can look up, more recent than the data I was just showing you. And I'm going to summarize it here. These are the main points I hope you get a feeling for. You don't have to remember the numbers. Just remember the principles and the functioning of these systems. They're incredibly efficient at cycling, at vacuuming in material from offshore, at receiving material from the continents, processing it, generating products, and moving them offshore as well as inshore again. So I'm going to leave it there, and I think you can. Thank you. Sorry for going over.
We'll save questions to the end for this. Next up, we have Jaap Nienhuis. Did I pronounce that right? From Utrecht University. We're really glad to have him talk about global river deltas and their relevance within Earth sediment source to sink.
Thank you so much, Bob, for this wonderful introduction in what deltas do. So I'm going to take it from there and take you a little bit upstream. I'm going to talk about the subaerial deltas, so what's on land. And what I'd like to do is quantify how relevant these deltas are for the global sediment cycle, and hopefully there will be some implications too for global cycles of other elements. And what do I mean with global river deltas? Let me turn this on. So what do I mean with global river deltas? Well, we recently started compiling a lot of great data sets of river deltas. This one includes 10,000 different river deltas. All of these red dots you see here are individual river deltas that we have in our databases, including the very nice ones like the Mississippi, the Lena, the Ebro, but also a lot of smaller river deltas, right? If you take a random section of the Earth's coastline, for example, here, northern Alaska, you see big systems like the Mackenzie, but you can zoom in further into the coast. You can see smaller deltas like the Colville, but you can zoom in even further and find deltas on very many different scales, right? So there are big deltas, but there are also small deltas that you shouldn't forget about. And all of these deltas are part of a sediment cycle or a sediment source to sink pathway, right? Sediment is being generated up on the continents and then flowing into the ocean, generating these big systems like you see here. But there's a very important feedback that I'd like to talk about with you all, and it's going to be the focus of my talk, is that, of course, the amount of sediment flux determines to a large extent the kind of delta that you end up developing. But of course, when you have a delta there, that can also greatly affect what kind of sediment is being stored in there and how much sediment is stored in there. So just the fact that you have deltas there is going to affect this source to sink pathway as well. And there are three key things that I'd like to discuss. First, how do they do that? What are physical reasons for the sediment being trapped on delta plains and not reaching the river mouth? Second, can we quantify globally how much of the global sediment flux is trapped in deltas? And then third, what are relevant controls for this sediment trapping? So first, how do deltas trap sediment? This is a great video. This is an experiment that you can find on YouTube as well by Stephen Lai and Kapar. This is looking at a delta from the side. And so sediments and water are being fed here. And you can see when I turn on the movie that a delta, a very simple delta, is developed. Right? So of course, delta reacts to the presence of water and the sediment starts to settle, and the delta grows over time. Right? And this is the delta foreset that Bob also referred to. But you can also see here this delta plane or delta topset very nicely developing. Right? And then the reason this topset develops, the reason that sediment is being captured before it even reaches the river mouth is because when the delta progrades, you need to maintain a slope for the sediment to actually make it to the river mouth. Right? So as you grow your delta, and as all Earth deltas have grown over the past 7,000 years, all of that sediment needs to make it to a river mouth that is further and further away. Right? And in order to make that slope, you need to deposit sediment and a grade, and that's why you see all of this sediment as well on the delta plane. So that's how deltas trap sediment on the delta plane as they grow. And of course, this is happening in a lateral or in a cross-section perspective, but if you zoom out and look at deltas in the plan view, of course, you have aggradation, which also generate a lot of space in the delta floodplains, right, where mud and carbon and other important elements can settle. And so these both perspectives make that you trap a lot of sediment on delta plains. So with that, can we then try to quantify what fraction of sediment actually never makes it to the river mouth, but instead gets trapped? Well, if you have a lot of data, what you can do is first, of course, find out how much sediment is delivered to the delta. So, for example, for the Mississippi River Delta that you see here, for cases where we have a lot of data, for example, the Mississippi River Delta, of course, we have good records of how much sediment is being supplied to the delta every year. Right? And for the Mississippi Delta, luckily, what we also have is a lot of surface elevation tables. So these are these type of measurements that allow us to track how much sediment is accreting every year. Right? But this is a very painful method. There are 200 of those in the Mississippi River Delta, and you need to go back a lot and measure whether or not your surface elevation has changed. And when you do that, when you integrate a lot, you get these nice maps. So this is a map of the Mississippi River Delta Plain. And you can see how much sediment is being accreted over the time. Right? You can then, of course, count all of that up and say this is the amount of volume that has been accreting on the Delta Plain. And what Sanks et al. Found in their paper was that about 30% of the sediment that makes it to upstream of the Mississippi Delta never makes it to the river mouth, but instead is accreting on the Delta Plain, right? So 30% in this case, which of course is an important number. However, this is something that you cannot do globally, right? If you want to know this number for the global ocean or global deltas, you cannot kind of start doing this surface elevation table thing. So another way you can try to go about what fraction of sediment actually never makes it to the river mouth, but is captured on delta plains, is look on slightly longer time scales and bigger pictures. So you can look into global data sets that exist of the amount of sediment that being delivered to all global deltas. So this is a data set, WM set from Cohen et al. 2014, trying to estimate what type or how much sediment is being delivered to deltas over the past 7,000 years. So basically, since deltas started to grow along Earth's coastlines. We can then combine that by making very simple estimates of global delta volume. We have good global databases, like for instance, this database by Rebecca Caldwell showing global delta area. And we can then combine that then with geologic information about how much deltas have accreted vertically over the same time period. When you combine these global data sets, what you then find is that global sediment retention on all delta plains is about 25%. So 25% of the sediment flux is being generated on continents and never makes it to the river mouth, but is trapped on delta plains. And when you have this estimate for individual deltas, you can make plots like this one. So gray dots are all individual deltas, around 10,000 in this case. Right, and what I'm plotting here is the total sediment volume that was delivered to that delta compared to the amount of sediment volume that we can find in the delta plain. Right, the dashed line is this one-to-one line, so of course, obviously, you don't find as much sediment in the delta plain as that what was delivered. And on average, of course, this number is 25%. But what you can also see is that this black line is slightly steeper than this dashed line. So smaller deltas are going to be less efficient in capturing and trapping sediment compared to big deltas. Right? The Mississippi Delta was 30%. When you get to smaller deltas, they're much less efficient in trapping deltas. So as deltas grow and as deltas become bigger, they become muddier and they become more effective in trapping sediment. Then once we have this global data set of sediment trapping, we can also ask very other relevant questions about it, right? Does delta morphology matter? Deltas are these amazing features and they have very different shapes and channel sizes, channel widths, and shoreline patterns. So does that influence how much they can trap and how much they can store? And again, a feedback can develop, right? Because if you are able to store much more sediment, that in turn might determine what kind of morphology you can develop as a delta. So again, there's a feedback. But does morphology matter? Well, to do that, we first need to get an idea of what delta morphology is and how to quantify delta morphology. So this is something I've worked on in the past couple of years. And how we define or quantify delta morphology is with three very relevant fluxes that affect most river deltas. First, you have the river sediment flux. Of course, this is a schematic river delta or river mouth. So you have a river sediment flux being feeding the river delta. Then once you get to the mouth, you get a tidal sediment flux that moves sediment in and out of the river mouth every tidal cycle. And then along the coast, you have a wave-driven sediment flux. So waves can pick up the sediment, move it along the coast, and then also change delta morphology. And when waves dominate, you get into delta morphology, so delta patterns like the eel here, very smooth and flat coastline shapes, because all the fluvial sediment that's being delivered is immediately picked up by waves and moved along the coast and also further offshore. When tides dominate, you get tide-dominated deltas. And what you see here in terms of the morphology then, for example, estuaries or deltas like the Elbe, you get river mouth width that are much wider than the river width upstream, right? You get this classic trumpet shape that estuaries have, just because you need to accommodate a lot of tidal water and tidal sediment going back and forth every tidal cycle. And when you don't have much tides or waves, you get river-dominated deltas like the Mississippi. You develop mouth bars. You can split channels and create these classic river-dominated birdfoot deltas. All right, so we have now kind of an objective scheme to say what type of morphology we expect for deltas. How do we then try to see what global deltas are in terms of morphology? We first need to have some global data. So we extract this Q wave, this wave-driven sediment flux globally using hindcast data sets like NOAA WaveWatch, get long-term records of wave heights, wave directions, wave periods affecting the global coastline. We get tidal information from tidal products like the OSU TOPEX model, where we know for each of these river mouths and each of these deltas what the tidal amplitudes are and tidal constituents. So we can estimate this global tide-driven sediment flux in and out of the river mouth. And then this data set I alluded to before, this is this global river-derived sediment flux data set, WMSED, where we know for each delta how much fluvial sediment is feeding them. Then we can simply say, well, which of these three is biggest for each of these 10,000 different river deltas, and we get to plots like this one. Right, so all the blue triangles are wave-dominated deltas, reds are tide-dominated deltas, and green are river-dominated deltas. You immediately see like most deltas along the global coastline are wave-dominated deltas. Around 80% are wave-dominated, and a much smaller proportion is tide or river-dominated. However, when you look into the global flux of water that is moving from the continents to the ocean, what we find actually when we look at discharges, water discharge, that most of this water is moving through tide-dominated deltas when it reaches the ocean, right? So on average, tide and river-dominated deltas are much bigger than wave-dominated deltas. And the same is for sediment supply. Right? Most of the sediment that makes it from the continents to the ocean passes through river and tide-dominated deltas. Of course, we can put this thing back in this triangle again with river, wave, and tide dominance. And then all of these dots are individual deltas, and the size corresponds to the size of the delta. Right? So again, you see most deltas, small deltas are wave-dominated, and the bigger deltas, I think this is the Mississippi right here, this is the Amazon, see that those tend to be river or tide-dominated. So we now have a global data set of delta morphology. So back to this question of sediment trapping. Well, if we can then plot the same triangle and see how much sediment do we estimate is going to be trapped on these delta plains for all of these different river deltas, we again see that tide and river-dominated deltas are going to be most effective in trapping sediment. Right? So the morphology that they develop because of the interaction between rivers and tides is able to make big delta plains, a lot of channels, a lot of wetlands, and traps a lot of sediment globally. So the last thing I want to talk with you about are controls on sediment trapping, right? We have an idea now about global fluxes and the influence of global morphology, but are there other important factors that we should consider when we think about sediment trapping on delta plains? First, of course, when we go further north, then perhaps waves and tides don't matter as much as sea ice. So this is a nice study by Irina Overeem from CU Boulder, looking into the effects of ice on delta morphology. And what's very relevant for these Arctic deltas is that when they flood, oftentimes there's still a lot of river ice in the rivers in the delta, and there's also a lot of sea ice still very close to shore, right? So this is another example of that. So when you have flooding in spring, there's still a lot of ice, and actually the floodwater never really makes it to the coast, but instead either moves over the ice and disappears into cracks on the sea ice, or it moves under the ice. But in general, what we see is that in terms of land gain efficiency, right, how much bang for your buck do you get for your delta, how much land can you gain for a given amount of sediment, Arctic deltas are going to be much less efficient than other temperate deltas. right? So instead, what we find for Arctic deltas is a lot of sediment is stored on land because of flooding, because of river ice, or sediment is being exported further out to sea because of this sea ice. So there's probably more sediment trapping in Arctic deltas. What about the effect of humans on global deltas, and does that affect trapping as well? You can go back to this triangle of delta morphology, and then, of course, we can make this triangle with the idea that these are all fluxes before humans started affecting deltas. And then we can say, well, what if humans started affecting river sediment fluxes, right? We have good data sets of that as well. We can see, for example, here all the blues are deltas where humans have greatly decreased the sediment flux reaching the delta because of river dams primarily. And all these reds are cases where humans have greatly increased the amount of sediment flux reaching the coast primarily because of deforestation and land degradation. So we can put this back in this triangle of delta morphology and see how the effect of humans of deltas have made deltas move in this triangle, right? And so if deltas have moved up, that's because there's more river sediment flux, and deltas will become more river dominated over time because of deforestation. Or if, in case of river dams, you expect deltas to transition to wave or tide dominated deltas. So, for example, we can look at the Nile. Of course, they built the Aswan Dam in the 60s that greatly decreased the amount of sediment flux that made it to the coast. So we expect a more smoothing of the shoreline shape for the Nile river mouth and a lot of coastal erosion because of that as well. And we can see this, of course, in satellite imagery over time. Right? The coastline is eroding, and because of that, we also expect less sediment trapping in cases like this because you become more wave dominated over time. So in this case, humans lead to less sediment trapping likely over time. But there are, of course, other effects of humans. We like to build levees to protect ourselves from floods. I very much appreciate them living in the Netherlands. But of course, they affect sediment trapping in delta plains, right? If you're shielded from floods, you're shielded from sediments. So we have a global compilation of levees on delta plains, and we find that around 10% of global delta plains is now stuck within levees, so it doesn't receive sediment anymore. So humans, in that sense, also greatly decrease likely the amount of sediment trapping globally. So last thing, what about sea level? This is a very nice image, again, looking at a delta from the side, and this is sea level going up and down, so glacial cycles, for example. And you could see that the delta that develops, so the top set, there's not much foreset in this video, but the top set also greatly responds to sea levels going up and down over time. All right, so how does that affect sediment trapping? Well, you can look at the effects of the topset sediment deposition and sea level change, again, looking into these delta cross sections where this arrow shows how much sea level is going up and down. So in this case, sea level is going down. You get a scenario that we call forced regression. So, of course, you don't get much topset deposition anymore because the channel is really cutting into delta deposits. And then when sea level doesn't change very much, you get either a situation of fluvial grade or regression, and you trap more and more sediment on your delta plain as you raise your sea level. Into extreme scenarios like forced transgression, where you raise sea levels so much that you really disconnect from the river mouth, and all of the sediment actually is stored on the delta plain, and no sediment makes it out to the river mouth anymore. And this is this last situation of forced transgression is likely going to be affecting deltas more and more as sea levels rise into the future. So this is for global deltas. The amount in blue is the global sediment flux that we expect can actually make it to the ocean because of this forced transgression that will hit many river deltas. Right? So if we get into scenarios of 8 or 10 or 12 millimeters per year that are likely by the end of the century, we expect less and less sediment to actually make it to the river mouth and more that will be trapped on delta plains. So with that, this is kind of the takeaway that I thought of for my slides. So if you don't want to remember anything about sediments, please remember this. Right? So when you think about a river, it doesn't really empty into the ocean straight away, right, sad puppy? But instead, there's a delta there that does things too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have some time for a couple of questions.
I noticed in the map of Asia that you showed that the sediment delivery had increased, but I know since the Three Gorges Dam on the Changjiang, it's gone down by 30% in the last 20 years. Why doesn't it show up as one of your blue dots?
So it could be that the latest dam information is not yet incorporated into these in this model. So yes, so that takes some time. And of course, you transition like what happened in North America, you transition from great increase in sediment fluxes because of land degradation to a scenario where you build a lot of dams. So they're about to experience the same thing that we experienced here.
I think one of the points that comes out of this kinds of information is that the changes that human beings are making on the planet is they're not at all restricted to raising the CO2. They're totally altering the entire set of processes that rivers interact with the oceans as well.
Yes. Yeah, and for many deltas, these local processes are dominant.
Thank you for your talk. And I was wondering about the uncertainty associated with a change in the wave regime.
In the wave regime?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure yet. Of course, especially in the Arctic, waves will change greatly, but also along the other coasts. So I'm not sure if what the average global picture is going to be, but that's certainly interesting to incorporate as well.
Thanks, for the talk. I really like the morphology that you provided, or the characterization of the morphology into quite a simple framework. I guess from a biogeochemical point of view, and maybe this is going to be a question for the broader, at the panel discussion or whatever. Are there any steps that one could make in terms of the biogeochemical implications, or rather characterizing deltas in the same sort of way in terms of their biogeochemical impacts? Do you have any sense of that?
Very good point. Definitely like to think with you on that. So I would like to make that transition as well. You can think about residence time, for example, water and sediment in systems. So that might be a thing to capture into this framework too. But there might be many other parameters that would be worth looking into.
Ken. I'll just introduce our next speaker. So we'll have a series of 2 shorter talks. Our next speaker comes from the University of Houston, Brandy Carlson. Will be speaking to us about distributary channel dynamics, control water and sediment dispersal along deltaic coastlines.
So thanks for that introduction. So today I'm going to talk about largely about the Yellow River Delta, and I'm going to talk about how channel networks on deltas basically change and shift, and how that controls the dispersal of water and sediment to deltaic coastlines. So naturally, river deltas can build and destroy hundreds of square kilometers of land per century. And this happens through a process called avulsion, which is simply the relocation of a river. So for the Mississippi, it avulses on 1,000-year timescales. So in this map that I'm showing here, you can see these outlines, these colored outlines, each of which represents a place where the active channel was previously located and through avulsion has subsequently moved. So after the channel mouth moves to a new location, that's when a distributary channel and its surrounding delta lobe can experience erosion by tides and waves, whereas in its new location, it can actively build new deltaic land. So taken together, deltaic lobes built by distributary channels amalgamate to form the landform that we call a delta. So again, for the Mississippi, this avulsion timescale is thousands of years. So we can look to other places on Earth where avulsion timescales are shorter and observable on human timescales. So we're going to jump from where we were on the Mississippi to both the Yellow River Delta in China, and then we're going to make a really quick stop in Greenland to look at the Watson River Delta before the end of the talk. The reason that we're looking at both of these places is because they both have very high sediment loads, which drive rapid delta dynamics. Okay, so starting with the Yellow River Delta in China. So the Yellow River Delta builds in Northeast China. It's fed by the Yellow River, which is this blue line here. The brown outlined area is showing the drainage basin of the Yellow River. The headwaters are in the Tibetan Plateau. And this system starts off pretty sediment laden. So the upper Yellow River has roughly twice as much sediment as the lower Mississippi River. In its mid-reaches, the Yellow River passes through the Luss Plateau, which is a thick deposit of windblown, mostly silt and fine sand. So this is really easily erodible material. The Yellow River picks it up and transports this material downstream. So we've measured suspended sediment concentrations of up to 30 grams per liter on the lower Yellow River. That's pretty high. Historically, this river has transported 1 billion tons of sediment to the Bohai Sea per year with what's a relatively modest water discharge. So again, these high suspended sediment concentrations drive rapid delta dynamics. So here I'm showing a schematic of the Yellow River Delta, where again, this blue line is showing the active channel. And each of these black lines surrounding it is showing an abandoned distributary channel. And corresponding to each of those distributary channels, we have dates here on the right. So you can see these avulsions that are abandoning distributary channels happen frequently to the tune of about once per decade. So we have a really rich source of information for understanding the shifts in distributary channel networks over time for the system. And we can actually zoom into a couple of recently abandoned distributary channels that have occurred and which were captured in satellite record. So this is a time-lapse video. It will start in 1984. And what we see here is a delta lobe prograding into the Bohai Sea. It's prograding at about 1 kilometer seaward per year. In 1996, an engineered diversion routed water and sediment up to the northeast. Subsequently, we see that this abandoned distributary channel and lobe begin to erode due to tide and wave action. Meanwhile, where the active river is located, we see a new prograding lobe. Ultimately, we also began to see water and sediment getting routed through the north side of this levee. So there's a small natural avulsion that occurred and diverted, again, sediment and water to the north here. So, we're talking, three, well, I guess 2 diversions, and we're looking at, 3 delta lobes over the course of these several decades since 1984. Okay. So again, following an avulsion at the new river mouth, we see rapid shoreline progradation, but where we have a distributary channel that's been abandoned, we also see rapid shoreline retreat. So this purple outline is showing the modern Yellow River coastline. In yellow, we have the coastline as it was in 1976. In 1976, another engineered diversion occurred. Following that diversion, we, using satellite images, traced the shoreline and found that we had an erosion rate of over 400 meters per year. Similarly, after the 1996 diversion of Qingxueguo, which we saw in the satellite imagery, we again have a retreat rate that exceeds 400 meters per year. Following the avulsion, the natural avulsion of this distributary channel that happened in 2006, we see a much slower retreat rate of about 90 meters per year. So a lot can be tied up in these retreat rates, including changes in sea level, subsidence, wave climate, sediment supply, vegetation, and inherited morphology. But we're going to take a closer look at a couple of these lobes to understand what's happening here. And we'll start with Qingxueguo, so this lobe abandoned by diversion. Okay, so here we're zoomed in and looking at Qingxueguo. Importantly, following this engineered diversion, there was no input of water or sediment that was kept to this abandoned distributary channel. When we look at this image, we can see the levees of the channel. It's this kind of deep red color in satellite image. The picture on the right, I took this standing and looking out towards the Bohai Sea from this position where my pointer is. So we can see, again, these old levees here and here. They're about 600 meters apart in this picture. And we see that between the levees, there's a mudflat that's dissected by a tidal channel. And so this begs the question, physically, how does an abandoned distributary channel convert to a mudflat? And so we set out to do field work to capture that transition. So we did both summer and winter field work. We were interested in winter because this is the stormy season for this region. We collected topography and bathymetry data of the study site, and then we set up a suite of instruments from A to 8 prime, where we collected data on water depth, flow velocity, suspended sediment concentration, mudflat, and channel bed grain size. Just for brevity, I'm only sharing the time series for channel depth. But we see, that we have this nice mixed semi-diurnal system with the tides, and that's maintained with the exception of with the exception of the winter when we get these big storm events. And so these big storm events obscure our tidal signal and also enhance inundation of the distributary channel and surrounding delta lobe. Okay, so we have this distributary channel. Again, here are the levees in this schematic. Within it is a tidal channel. And when we have these either high tide events or events that are enhanced by storm events, sediment that is being transported or perhaps eroded by tides and waves along the Yellow River Delta front, these can be suspended and carried towards the distributary channel, and they can deposit on the surrounding mudflat. So this is a mechanism for grading an abandoned distributary channel that has no upstream supply of sediment or water. And this mechanism still actively fills this channel through some sediment coring that we collected. We found that there are fine sediments that are sitting on top of coarser sediments. The coarser sediments have a similar grain size to the active modern channel. And if we take the thickness of the fine sediments on top, we find that we can estimate an aggradation rate of about 2.5 centimeters per year by this mechanism. So in contrast, we have the Qingba lobe, which again, this was abandoned by a natural avulsion, and it has a much slower shoreline retreat rate. So it's retreating about 4 times slower than the shorelines of the engineered diversions. Again, this could happen for a handful of reasons, and we investigated this by looking at sediment transport due to waves. We monitored vegetation and considered the role of elevation at the time of abandonment to explore this. So importantly, Qingba maintains an active channel that disperses water and sediment to this naturally abandoned lobe. We notice some stark differences even from upstream to downstream of this distributary channel. So upstream, the elevations are high. We have elevations that range to supertidal. The dominant vegetation species that we see here is Phragmites, and we see much lower salinity measurements upstream. Downstream, we see Spartina as the dominant vegetation species, and we also see much higher salinities. And we think that the nature of how this channel was abandoned in terms of the actual channel depth at the time of abandonment was conducive to allowing vegetation to colonize this abandoned channel. And we try to quantify that by applying remote sensing and using the normalized difference vegetation index, so NDVI. We use this as a proxy for live green vegetation. So we studied so we applied this to the shorelines of each of these delta lobes, and we found that for the engineered diversions, the NDVI values were low, indicating that the shorelines were consistently barren during our observation period. However, for the lobe that maintains connection to the active channel, it's not only vegetated, but even after the distributary channel is diverted away through avulsion, the NDVI value continues to increase. And so, we think that this supports the idea that there is a vegetation difference between lobes, and importantly, it suggests that something about the channel at the time of abandonment was hospitable to vegetation in the case of the natural avulsion, but likely not in the case of the engineered diversions. And so we think this is important because it can set up an ecogeomorphic feedback where vegetation, which relies on elevation for both wetting frequency and duration and salinity conditions, and then once the vegetation is established, it can continue to promote sediment aggregation. So we think that these kind of pieces of the puzzle, vegetation, freshwater and sediment supply, and the morphology in terms of the channel bed elevation for the system played an important role in mediating shoreline retreat rates. And so, as I said, we'll quickly hop up to Greenland. So here we are, we're going to the Watson River Delta. Oh, sorry, am I at time?
Yeah, could you wrap up maybe just 1 minute?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and go to the conclusions. I'm happy to talk about the Arctic work later, but basically distributary channel dynamics control water and sediment dispersal along deltaic coastlines. For the Yellow River, we saw this manifest in different shoreline retreat rates, likely as a response to sediment and water supply to abandoned distributary channels. Yeah, I'll pause there. Thank you.
Next up is Elizabeth Chamberlain, also coming to us from the Netherlands, from Wageningen University. Sorry. Okay. And she will be speaking to us about tools for interrogating deltas.
Well, thank you. Here you can see the Mississippi Delta and in New Orleans, and it's already been discussed and shown up in the Mentimeter poll that these are biodiverse, they're resource-rich, densely inhabited, and also important to economy and industry places. So with delta research, we may focus on many differences in deltas, and this is why I have this snowflake up here. There's this idea that each delta might be different from each other. And also, when we do research, the dominant and active processes, the time and space scales, the research questions of interest, and ultimately the applications of our science might vary. So how do we measure change in deltas? Well, there are many, many tools, more than I can talk about in detail today. But here you can see a schematic showing some of the different options for different parts in the delta. So we're moving in the left from pretty far upstream, looking at a cross-section through the landscape and sediment. We have tidal channels. There's maybe a river coming through that's not shown here. And we might measure change here using satellite imagery like Landsat, using archaeological sites that capture ways that the delta was in the past. Short-lived radioisotopes like beryllium-7, lead-210, which is centennial scale, so not quite short-lived. The type of work that Brandy mentioned, looking at ADCP, tidal dynamics, and changes at the coast as well. Here are a couple of examples of these type of methods. So in the upper left, you can see marker horizons. This is where we put down some type of material on the present surface, and then we come back later and see how much sediment has accumulated on top of it. So brick dust, for example, ceramic tiles might be used. This lets us look at seasonal or relatively short timescale accumulation of sediment in delta plains. There's also work with archaeological sites. So this is a picture in the lower right from some work that Till, who's speaking next, has done. And he looked at kiln sites in the coast of the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta and how they had subsided or decreased in elevation relative to present-day sea level. We can also use historic maps to look at where channels were in the past or changes in the shoreline, and satellite imagery to look at that today over decadal timescales. And then rod surface and elevation tables, which Jaap mentioned in his talk. These act over different timescales. So there are different timescales of processes in the delta, and there are also different timescales that are captured by the different methods. So in this figure, we have the age range, how far back the different methods go on the x-axis. And we have the time of resolution, whether they're capturing processes like tidal dynamics that act over a few hours, or whether they're capturing longer processes like human land usage and river channel migration, or avulsion, like Brandy mentioned, that are acting over maybe hundreds to thousands of years in different places. So the type of method that we pick is a function of this kind of question we have: what process are we looking at? And then how does that method fit? How far back can it go? And do we have it available for our landscape? If we're using radiocarbon dating, do we have good carbon preserve that we can measure? This is from a review paper that we wrote in 2020. So if you're interested more in the individual methods, you can look into it, or I'm happy to talk about it more later. And now we're going to zoom in to this time scale here. So kind of in between human land usage, river channel migration, and avulsion, the switching of the lobes in the delta, and look at optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL dating. So luminescence is a natural phenomenon that you may be familiar with already. For example, fireflies can luminesce, they produce light. And there's also bioluminescent algae, which I guess some people here are familiar with or have worked with. And sand grains can also luminesce. So in this case, quartz or feldspar minerals are able to trap energy when they're exposed to radiation, when they're buried. And over time, the longer they're buried, the more radiation they accumulate and the more energy they trap in their crystal lattice. When they're exposed to light, they release that energy in the form of a small flux of light. And that's measurable, and it serves as a clock for when they were buried. In this sense, you can think of OSL as the sands of time. So now we'll go a little bit into the details of how this works, and it's something I'm really happy to talk about with you more later as well. So the grains are moving and they're being exposed to sunlight. They may be moving in the wind, they may be moving in a river channel in the water, but if they're getting sunlight, they're not storing this energy. It's being zeroed, so their clock is at 0. And then they get buried. They're deposited maybe in a natural levee, in a flood bank, in a tidal channel, but they get deposited and they're exposed to radiation from the elements that are surrounding them, so thorium, potassium, uranium. And with time, this causes energy to accumulate in their crystal lattice structure. We sample them, and we're very careful not to expose these sediments to light. So when we sample them, their clock is intact. And we take them back to a laboratory. Here you can see the laboratory that I work at in the Netherlands Center for Luminescence Dating. This is our website. And we measure them here under a safe wavelength of light, so we can measure how long they've been buried. So OSL directly dates the time of sediment deposition. And now I'm going to show you a few examples of what can we do with this type of tool. Here, this is in Louisiana, in the Mississippi Delta, where I lived for a very long time. And you can see on the left, yeah, your left, my right. You can see a picture of a bayou. So this is one of these abandoned river channels that Brandy was talking about, where the channel used to have a lot of water and sediment and nutrients flowing through it. And now the main channel has moved somewhere else, and this is what we're left with. And the image here is showing a network of these channels coming down to the coast. So this is one of the old delta lobes before the delta channel avulsed or moved to a different area. And we studied this, and we saw that it had built out with time. Based on the stratigraphy, it showed that this had grown into open water or prograded. And then by dating it with OSL, we were able to track the movement of the shoreline. So the ages you see here are in thousands of years, and we showed that this lobe built out into open water from 1600 to 600 years ago, so over 1,000 years. And we were able to reconstruct its growth rates, its growth patterns, and how much land it created in that time. That kind of information is useful for coastal restoration, so looking at what's possible if we divert water and sediment to try to build new land. And it also tells us about fundamental delta dynamics, how these kind of systems operate here in the Mississippi Delta. There's also some recent work we have in the Mississippi Delta. This is Dr. Kelly Sanks. She's a postdoc at Tulane, and she's looking at carbon sequestration in the lobe that I just showed, and also in a basin where new water and sediment will be routed, called a diversion receiving basin. And so in the cross-section, the red is the sand, and these are all delta sediments of different types. There's mouthbar sand, flood basin, different types of deposits that were formed when this Lafourche lobe was active. And we've OSL dated these deposits, so we know how quickly they accumulated and when they accumulated. And Kelly has measured the organic soil carbon accumulation in these deposits. So we can put that information about how much organic carbon is in the sediments with how quickly they accumulate and start looking at storage rates of carbon in the delta here. So if we understand these types of things, how deltas change, processes that drive their change, and how they can fit into global systems, for example, through carbon sequestration, then the next step is to apply this knowledge. And these are a couple of slides I added at the last minute, inspired by a conversation I had, the first conversation at OCB with Victoria, talking about nature-based solutions and big picture looks at things. So ecosystem services is a conceptual framework that we can use for our science. And the idea is that an ecosystem service is any positive benefit that wildlife or ecosystems provide to people. So when we look at restorations and applying natural processes to understand landscape change and to engineer sustainable landscapes, it could be really useful to consider the flora and fauna, people, landscapes, and the different components of the landscape, and how all of these different resources and attributes interact with each other. This is also the basis for nature-based solutions. So the idea of building with nature, of using natural processes and incorporating them in our management to make more sustainable management approaches, things that are agreeable and long-term, and that act both for people, but also for the ecology, for plants and animals. And here you can see an image of the sand motor. This is a Dutch nature-based solution where rather than revisiting an eroding beach every year and depositing fresh sand, they've done one mega nourishment, put a lot of sand in, and are slowly letting it disperse over decades to maybe a century through waves, tides, and current. And in the engineering of this, they've also created beach space for people. They've created intentional lakes that serve for biodiversity for fish and birds. And the goal then is to create stable dunes that protect the shoreline from storms and erosion. So the takeaways that I hope I got across are that dating tool selection is guided by the research question that you have, the available material, and there are so many different tools that you can choose from. OSL is one of these, and it's a way to date sediments. It's our sands of time. It's useful for landscape reconstruction and other aspects. And ultimately, conceptual frameworks can be considered as emerging tools also to interrogate deltas. And these can lead to green or guest salt approaches to landscape management. These are also very inherently interdisciplinary because we're looking at plants, animals, sediments, people, everything. So I'm really happy to be here at OCB and to share this with you and to also hear about the marine sciences and biogeochemistry research going on. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions.
The OSL is a fascinating technique. How accurate if you compare different systems,
Yeah. So the uncertainty of it is relative. It's about 5 to 10%. So if we're dating something that was deposited 100 years ago, we have an uncertainty on it of maybe 10 years. If it was deposited 1,000 years ago, we have an uncertainty of about 100 years. And that's more or less true across systems. And then within OSL, there are different suites of tools. So I didn't mention today feldspar dating, which is IRSL. It's infrared stimulated luminescence. And that's really useful in active margin deltas and coasts, where the quartz doesn't luminesce the way we'd like all the time. So it really depends on the geology of your landscape. In some places, we use quartz sand. In some places, we use quartz silt. In some places, we use feldspar sand. The different tools within OSL go back different time scales as well.
I'm just curious. So when you have a lot of reworked sediments, do you look for like the youngest age in this method?
Oh, yeah. So I think you're hinting in part that we're relying on the clock being reset by light, right? And if the grains are moving in the wind, that's a pretty safe assumption. But if grains are moving in a river, some of them might be moving as bedload on the bed of the river, and maybe they don't see light. Maybe they were eroded from a Pleistocene cliff straight into the river, moved along the bed, and got deposited. And you sample them, you're going to get a Pleistocene age, even if it was deposited 10 years ago. For that, we measure very small numbers of grains or even single grains. And we look at a collection. So we always measure multiple grains or multiple aliquots, subsamples including grains, for every sample. And we look at the distribution of ages we get from these submeasurements. And we statistically, if we think that some grains were not exposed to light, then we statistically isolate the ones that were and get the youngest age within the population.
All right, let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.
And the last talk before lunch, coming from Coastal Carolina University, we have Phil Hannebus speaking to us about sea level and river deltas across timescales, from the last lowstand to modern anthropogenic alterations.
Yeah, hello everybody, and thanks for having me here. Yep, thanks. When I woke up the next morning and I looked at this title I submitted, I thought, who the heck can deliver that in 20 minutes? So good luck, dude. And therefore, I modified my title a little bit. Now it's open. What I want to do is, first of all, I want to start with a modern system and make it a little bit more complicated, building on the former talks. And then I want to go offshore with you. I'm actually a marine geologist. And once we're offshore, I want to go back in time. All right, so why delta and sea level? Because deltas, they form at sea level. Sediment is transported by water, so there's, with little exceptions, no real way to accumulate above water. And this is why most of the delta is below water and right at the sea level. And therefore, how do I move? Okay, and this also means, of course, that the delta is full of water. So we saw this in the previous talks already, that there's material flux into one direction, sometimes by the tides or by storm surges, also into the other direction. But if you look at this list here, I know you're interested in vegetation and organic matter and this kind of stuff. Of course, there are very different types and plenty of different types of wetlands in coastal plains and in deltas. I colorized them a little bit. Some are more on the fluvial side, so maybe not influenced by tides, not influenced by salinity. And then we go into this transition in yellow here, where we have isolated basins, which are only connected to the hydrology during exceptional times, so extreme high tides or storm surges or something like that. And then we go down into the coastal zone. Of course, here the salinity and the tides might play a much bigger role on different time scales. So we have a succession of different ecosystems, but also of different, I would call it basins, sedimentation basins, which that are somehow controlled and connected by hydrology, sometimes frequently, every day, every hour, sometimes every season or over the years maybe. So there's hydrodynamic control, which results in different sedimentation dynamics for each of these different wetlands, which also results, of course, in various or changing chemical parameters and characteristic vegetation parameters. All right, so if we look at material origin, here mainly organic matter, we have these three partitions, so the fluvial part, and then the deltaic part, and also the coastal and offshore part. And there's a lot going on. So we have remote sources, for instance, from a catchment area. If the catchment area is big, there might be several tributaries, different rocks, different soils, different elevation, maybe different climate and precipitation. So already there might be a pretty mixed signal. And then, of course, it runs through the country, through the land, and crosses different zones of vegetation. Often we also have incisions and contribution of old peat soils. So that is, of course, a nightmare for everyone who wants to work with fresh signals. And then we go into this big mixer, the mixing zone. So first the deltaic wetlands, which of course are also productive in terms of aquatic life, and down to the coastal tidelands. And these two are connected with each other by sea level, which we can translate into water levels, actually, connecting all these different wetlands. All right, and the more we go towards the ocean, of course, we get into saline or brackish vegetation, into saline or brackish primary productivity. But as Bob, for instance, said, of course, we also now get a strong influence by the ocean. Not to forget the tidal pumping, because usually these openings, they are pretty estuarine. So the tidal pumping, bringing organic material and other material from the ocean to the land, is significant and important here. All right, why does it matter? Well, if you're interested in carbon, it is different types of carbon that are produced here and also at different rates. So if we now change sea level just a little bit, let's lift it a little bit, the whole system has to migrate backwards or upstream, let's say. You could call this saltwater intrusion or something like that, but it will certainly convert maybe the highest, the wetlands with the highest productivity, the freshwater marshes and wetlands, into a more brackish environment. So there's a significant change in wetlands and ecosystems then. All right, and If we step back a little bit, it looks like a delta is just a body of sediment. But if we go, the closer we go, the more vibrant, the more pulsing this river mouth actually is. So let's go to the Mekong Delta, just as one example out of course, many. There is, of course, a seasonality in water discharge. The seasonality in water discharge also means the seasonality in sediment discharge. So now over the years, this is a time span of 5 years here. Over the years, every year is a little bit different. Of course it is. And if there's more discharge in water, there might be more discharge in sediment. Some years, the sediment supply and discharge is not very high, actually. So this might do something with the delta, but particularly with the sediment exports towards the coastal ocean. All right, so it is pulsing. It is very variable. Here, just as an example, we have a recent decline here in the Mekong Delta of sediment supply by something like 50 megatons or so. That is a third of the sediment supply, just due to natural reasons, because sometimes, you know, it depends on where the delta or the region is hit by a hurricane, bring a lot of precipitation. All right, so what does it mean for our estuarine kind of delta in terms of material export and availability to the ocean? This can heavily vary from event to event or season to season or year or over the decades. So if the supply is, you know, more enhanced, is more dominant, then of course there's much more sedimentation on the continental shelf, or maybe not sedimentation, but just a suspended load supply, which then can be distributed over the ocean, across the ocean. Or if the discharge is relatively small, aka sea level starts rising, then the deposition would move really into this estuary, leading to shallowing and widening, for instance, maybe of the channels here. But hopefully, or you know, if there are not too many levees and embankment, also on the delta plains. So this can be cycles at very different timescales. And this brings us to sea level. And I just want to, you know, don't want to go through all of this. So the sediment supply here can have, you know, the variability can have local or regional or global reasons. And on short time scales, of course, it's more local. We heard about flooding and cyclone events, for instance, some internal avulsion processes, this kind of stuff. The coastal ocean might play a big role. When we talk and think about sea level, usually you think about the eustatic, the global sea level signal. I talk about this in a second. But it's not only what, you know, this pulsing delivery to the ocean, but also it has a very strong buffering component in it because it can store, it can retain a lot of sediment or organic matter. So this can, for instance, be because there is a kind of aeration signal in a big catchment area, or it can be this kind of temporary storage and retainment, and then maybe with the next storm surge or so, it can be a big pulse. Okay, so we have to talk. This is why I call it pulsing. It's like, you know, like our heart actually. We hope it is cyclic in our interpretation, but it can be very episodic. It can be short or long lasting. It can be that a pulse gets really stretched and delayed and extended, or it can be that the delivery is sharp and in one pulse. So we just need to make sure that we understand that these kind of filtering systems between land and ocean are anything else than static. All right, so this brings us to sea level now. And I don't want to focus on this too much because there are plenty of different reasons why sea level is changing. Of course, they are all combined. But when we talk about sea level change and look at a delta in a certain region or locality, we have to consider much more than just a little bit of global sea level rise and maybe a little bit of land sinking because there are so many processes. And in addition, of course, the urbanized deltas, the land use modified deltas, they also have a lot of anthropogenic components. So it's not like a little bit of compaction or something like that, but there are various parameters we need to consider, and there are a couple of really nice papers that come out over the past 2 or 3 years trying to understand, to get a better grip on each of these parameters here. All right, so this is sea level on short term and makes it really complicated to understand how fast sea level is changing and what it means for a local delta, because there are so many local components. But we can be very sure that the wetlands, so these organic reactors and producers, they will be most affected by it. All right, just to give you an example, we have a teeny tiny baby delta in South Carolina, the Santee Delta. I just wanted to show you about this variability. So we have the local compaction, so there's subsidence, global isostatic adjustment that is over regional, then we have the global sea level rise here, and now our coastal ocean changes too, because of the Gulf Stream, because of wind pattern, because of fluvial discharge. So in this time interval over 20 years, it even dropped a little bit, which was good for our coastal lowlands. Then over this time period here, suddenly we jumped up from 3 millimeters per year, which is a little lower than the global sea level rise nowadays, up to 14, 15 millimeters per year, just because the ocean height has changed. So it's not only this global component. Some of these oceanic variations are predictable and show decadal cycles. Many of them are not. It really depends on where the next hurricane did landfall and how long this discharge event will last then. All right. So what is interesting actually to get a delta stabilized is that it needs both. It needs inundation and exposure and drying phases. So for inundation, it is important, and Liz talked about this, if they are embanked, then the accumulation of sediment on the delta plane is pretty much suppressed. But this happens mainly during inundation, of course. But it's also important to get it exposed, because this is the moment that the lithic fraction really gets incorporated into the soils, consolidates there, and stabilizes there. So if a delta is supposed to grow with the rising sea level, we need to offer it these two stages and opportunities, actually. The problem is, and we heard about this, that most of our deltas, they start to be starved of lithic sediment because of river damming, for instance. The reservoir catches it a lot. So they turn, it seems many of them turn more and more into an organic soil delta, mainly accumulating organic soil. Organic soil can very much dry out and shrink, and at the same time also decompose, of course. So that is another layer of problems. Anyway, so if we go a little bit further back in time, this is again the Mekong Delta, a geographic and a geological expression. If you go back in time, longer time scale, what happens when sea level changes a little bit? We heard about erosion, for instance. The message here I wanted to convey is if you start to go into deeper layers of the delta, it is very heterogeneous. It's not like, all the same and has a level of, 4% organic matter or something like that, but it's very differentiated spatially, but also stratigraphically. And you see that also the underlying topography plays a big role, how big a delta, how thick a delta sequence actually is. So if you look at the delta from a plane view here, you actually don't get a real clue how much sediment organic matter is stored in this delta. All right, so let's go offshore real quick. And Bob talked about this a little bit. So then there is this export, and I could, of course, talk years about just these processes here. In the end, we often find these kind of muddy deposits offshore. Sometimes they are associated and linked, connected to a delta. Often they are detached. The classical term probably is mud belt. They're usually pretty silty. Not very rich in organic matter, but they are really part of this kind of fluvial supply system to the open ocean. Why they form and how they form can be very individual, really depending on location, on the topography of the shelf, on the local hydrodynamics. Shelves are really complicated. It's not like a shelf is a simple other filter or something like that. I spent most of my life and my scientific life on shelves. There are upwelling, downwelling cells. There are eddies. There are focus currents. There are vertical fronts and horizontal fronts and convection cells and diversion cells and so on. So for sediment to cross the Conti shelf, it's challenging, even in suspension. It takes time. It can be very pulse-like and stepwise. I just mentioned this because if you take sediment cores, for instance, or sediment surface samples along a mud belt here, each site will show you a little bit different story, actually, because they're extremely sensitive to oceanographic forcing, for instance. What happens if sea level rises? They have to follow the coastline. What happens if sea level drops? They are just gone. So from the past, we almost have no this kind of deposition because when the shelf is exposed, those are the first sediments which will be eroded. All right, so another filter. And now I really want to go back in time and see what happens if sea level really drops and exposes the continental shelf. I want to go here to the Sunda Shelf. Here's the Mekong Delta. A huge area which was exposed by about 800 kilometers during the sea level low stand, last glacier maximum. And based on seismic lines and sediment cores, we were able to reconstruct. There was a delta at that time, which was certainly way bigger than the deltas we have today, because it has this huge catchment area and combined a couple of rivers. Then during deglacial time, so sea level rise, this thing drowned here, and we got into this kind of transgressive system. So when, this is actually when all the former channel systems and the main valley started to fill up with fine grains of organic rich matter. So I wanted to show this because, first of all, if you look up here, this is the geophysical line. All the horizontal lines are related to former sea level low stand. And then we get nice, here for instance, nice delta, so some progradational preserved. Then we had another low stand. We have a lot of channels here, which might be river channels or tidal channels. And if you look at the sediment, it really depends on, how old the sediment is and where you took it here. So we took plenty of sediment cores. When sea level drops, usually there is massive decomposition and massive erosion, not only within the main channels, but area-wide. This is not really textbook knowledge, but this is what we observed, that during last sea level low stand, the whole area was eroded down by 20 meters or something like that. So they are pretty organic poor. We just see pyrite traces of organic material. The modern sediments are relatively organic low, organic poor, but then these incised valley fills and incised channel fills, they are full of organic matter. All the black stuff here, old mangrove roots and a lot of PT, detrital deposits. Old material, if you date with radiocarbon, this is all reworked material, but plenty of it. All right, and then the next step, of course, is the delivery to the ocean, to the deep ocean. So here's the shelf edge with a big regressive deposition succession. This is deltaic mainly. Then here the continental bottom at the continental slope. There are with mass deposits, so a very efficient mechanism during sea level low stand to get a lot of material into the deep ocean. Okay, so what does it mean if we, from the paleoceanographical side, for instance, or paleoclimatic, are interested in that? There is really a nice coupling between sea level shown here in blue, and then the transfer from land to ocean, of course, through the exposed shelf plane and through this delta in suspension into the open ocean. So we see this here, this is clay here, with rising sea level. The signal was really strong during lower sea level. This is the early deglacial times here, and then levels out to modern, well, not modern height here. Marine productivity, terrestrial plants. We can nicely see how, terrestrial material was delivered to the open ocean directly, the South China Sea. but also how the marine productivity has shifted back with flooding of the continental shelf. So formerly it was here, the highest productivity right in front of the continental shelf, the upper continental slope area. And then with the drowning of the shelf, it really followed the coastline, and now it's on the inner shelf. So there's a very strong sea level control, actually. And literature often says there's a long delay, might be some hundreds of thousands of years between sea level drowning and then the export to the ocean. What we saw here, this is from the Pearl River, so just a little bit further north. You see the temperature rise here. Here's meltwater pulse 1A, so a rapid warming. And at the same time, so here we have terrestrial plants, a terrestrial plant biomarker. It really dropped within a few points here, and then it went down to the modern level. So in this case, what we think is global warming led to the global meltwater pulse 1A. That was about 25 meters of water, additional water in 300 years, so an extreme sea level rise. And immediately this oceanographic system responded in terms of the composition of organic matter. All right, last slide. This is a very nice study here, compiling plenty of records from a global scale. Just looking at the total organic matter, mass accumulation rate, various regions across the world ocean, and what you can nicely see, so now we are back at 150,000 years, so this is kind of 1.25 of glacial interglacial cycles. Here's the sea level curve, parallels with isotope curve, doesn't matter so much here, but what you nicely can see is whenever the sea level was really low, when we had the low stands, they say, globally about 50% more organic matter was delivered to the ocean during sea level low stands. Of course, most of it has to go through deltas. All right. And here I would stop and want to thank you. This is a photo here from the innermost part of the Mekong Delta. Geographically, it is still the delta plain, it's wetland, it's just a normal delta. If you look at the succession, this is a very oxidized, organic-free Pleistocene soil. Here's a little channel which is really full of organic-rich mangrove soil. And then there's a little bit of wetland soil on top, which partly floods during storm surges. All right, thanks so much.
We have time for a couple questions.
Hi. The Thunder Shelf and glacial interglacial work is very interesting, at least to me. So I wonder if you have quantified like the buried organic carbon, and you also mentioned the pyrite. I mean, you talk about the buried organic carbon glacial interglacial variations, and there's even like an O2 concentration differences, I believe, like on that sort of time scale. So pyrite formation and pyrite weathering, when you have the shelf exposed, I think that has some impact for O2 as well. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you or anybody has done any quantification and see whether, from an organic carbon perspective and pyrite perspective, how much does it help to explain the 100 ppm CO2 variations or O2 variations? Is not on top of my head in terms of numbers, but that sort of changes.
Mm-hmm. So, thanks. Great question. I apologize. I'm the wrong person. I'm a geologist. I never looked at an answer for your first or your second question. And I'm not aware of if really somebody tried to quantify that. Certainly, these wide tropical shelves, certainly it contributed a lot during glacial and interglacial transition times in any regards. I agree with that. We still even don't really know how the vegetation during low sea level, so during glacial times, looked like. Some people say it was a nice tropical rainforest. Others want to have it much drier. I think that is not really answered. And then, as I said, many of the soils got heavily eroded during sea level low stand. So I think that is a very good question for an oceanographer to look at sediment cores further offshore. My question also is, do we see export of organic matter to the deep ocean in peaks? So for instance, during the meltwater pulses, we had at least 3 meltwater pulses, which significantly shift the coastline. I would expect in a really high resolution archive, you should see this kind of export peak. But I have to disappoint you.
No, I mean, yeah, these places are huge, so they probably matter on this time scale. But yeah, I guess we just have to quantify them if there's a way to do that.
One more question, or we could break for lunch. We're very excited to continue our discussion on the role of deltas in regulating biogeochemical cycles with some talks on biogeochemistry. I'd like to introduce Kanchan Maiti from Louisiana State University, and he'll be talking to us about oxygen and carbon dynamics in river-influenced shelf sediments. Go away.
Thanks. So I'll start by saying that I was really encouraged yesterday's dinner to realize none of us really, or most of us define deltas very differently. So I'm going to push that limit of delta boundary in today's talk. And we also heard in the morning talk from Bob that a lot of the sediments are not retained in these deltas. And then Jaap gave this really nice average value of 25% sediments that are retained, which means 75% of those sediments on average, maybe 50%, if it is a really efficient delta, are getting all over the shelf adjacent to the delta. And so this talk is about what happened and how these sediments are really impacting these self-biogeochemistry once they're out there. So we have seen this figure too, we can see there is a huge variability in sediment distribution out there. There's a lot of seasonality. So there's a lot of sediments that is coming out at different time and different amount along with the river discharge. And they can be dispersed over a wide area. You can see for Amazon shelf, the sediments that are not retained in the delta itself, that's dispersed over 600,000 kilometers square area. And you can see it's for most delta systems, it's a big area we are talking about that are indirectly getting influenced by these sediments that are being delivered by the river. So what does that mean in terms of our carbon cycle? So we know that most of these deltas have really high productivity going for them. They're also a big source of terrestrial organic matter they are bringing in with these sediments. So they end up being one of the biggest areas, depot centers for organic matter. And you can see right here, about 40% of the carbon that are buried globally ends up buried in the continental margins that are more influenced by the rivers because of these factors. Once they're buried, what happens to these carbon? And before we go there, we can look at the life cycle of the carbon that is coming in from these deltas. So we have two components to that. So we have these rivers that are usually high in DIC, dissolving organic carbon. They're bringing in the nutrients. Usually, if it is a really high river flow, you end up with a strong stratification, especially if the wind is not strong. If there is a strong wind or a less discharge of river, you end with a weak stratification. Whatever be the case, it usually ends with a lot of primary productivity happening here, that is taking out CO2, producing a lot of organic matter, coupled with the terrestrial organic matter that comes in, that sinks to the bottom. Some of the organic matter gets remineralized in the water column, and it moves offshore as DIC and POC. So what about the carbon that sinks to the bottom? So once it sinks to the bottom, especially if there is a stratification, this bottom water gets isolated from the top water column. So these sediments that have a lot of organic matter in them, both terrestrial and marine, they start running the show here in the bottom water. So they will usually be remineralized. If there's a lot of oxygen, it's mostly aerobic respiration that is favored. And that leads to a big flux of material coming out. mostly in form of dissolved inorganic carbon. There can be other material like phosphorus that Shaily will be talking about. Alkalinity, that's a big factor. It's much more complicated to look at that. And so there's a lot of flux that is coming out from these adjacent shelves that are impacted by the deltas. And in that same terrain, we can think of this oxygen that is the main driver of this process can get reduced, cause hypoxia, and that's why we see hypoxia to be very common with these delta systems. But while a lot of focus is played on these carbon cycle and how much carbon actually gets transported from the coastal to deep ocean, oftentimes this aspect of benthic flux is not well represented in the carbon budget. And we can see that. I mean, this is from Northern Gulf of Mexico carbon budget. It came out of one of these OCB workshops a few years back. And things have gotten better. There's not that many question marks anymore. But one thing that hasn't really gotten better is the bottom benthic boundary flux. And that still remains, those questions are still there. So how does that work out? So if you try to look at the benthic fluxes, I would say the master controller in this is oxygen. Oxygen is the big player here. We can start with oxygen. And as I said, you look at the deltas and you look at this hypoxia zone. So hypoxia is defined as less than 2 milligrams of oxygen per liter of water. And we can see almost all these delta systems, they're associated with hypoxia just because of this rain of organic matter to the seafloor that is consuming oxygen. And here is a really nice accumulation of oxygen, sediment oxygen consumption across the, from a global point of view. And you can see those big circles, most of them tend to be near river mouths. So we can think of oxygen as the master controller. But when we look at this oxygen consumption rate, there are a lot of nuances to how we look at this data. So there are multiple ways. Everybody has their favorite way of measuring oxygen in the seafloor. So we can briefly look at some of the most common ones. So TOU, this is a term I'll be using throughout this talk, total oxygen uptake, DOU, diffusive oxygen uptake. So TOU is most traditionally measured across the globe. It's very simple. You have a sediment core incubation. You look at the change in oxygen over time. You know the area, you know the volume, you can calculate the flux. You can use that either by collecting pristine sediment cores, or you can do it the hard way like I usually do, put a lander in the bottom of the ocean, pray it comes back after 2 days. If it doesn't come back, probably I can actually lose it only once in my career. I know that. Insurance will be pulled out. But at the end of the day, both of these methods does give us a good estimate. People often debate about lander being better at giving us a more pristine, less disturbed measurement, but nuances are still there. Like, for example, what is the storing rate inside the system? Because if you change the rate of mixing of water inside the system, you change the entire dynamics. And if it doesn't match with the outside current regime, they can give you very different flux rates, right? And that may not be comparable with the reality. So it doesn't matter which method we use. If you're using different, we are not really paying attention, this can make it very difficult to compare across many different studies. So that's where diffusive oxygen uptake eliminates a lot of these, what I call operational issues that varies from lab to lab. Everybody has their own setup. And what this does, this actually, we put out a lander that has these microelectrodes. It sits on the sea floor, and it can actually sample the sediment at micromillimeter or sub-millimeter scale resolution. This particular profile that I have, these are profiling in situ at this sea floor at 200 micrometer interval. And we can see we need to do that at that resolution, because right here in this example, the oxygen penetration is 2 millimeter. That's it. And here, the oxygen penetration in this section is about 3.5 millimeter. And by doing this kind of high resolution oxygen profiling, we can actually calculate the flux. It's a pretty simple fixed equation. If you know the oxygen diffusivity, dC by dZ, you get your DOU. And what it does is it eliminates many of these operational issues because it's a simple, more straightforward way. especially if we couple this with the ADV that can give us the bottom current that really provides us with a context of this oxygen consumption at the seafloor. There's another really good method that is the eddy covariance. There's not much paper that are out there on this. It's not that popular yet, but that's also a method, but I'm not going to talk about it. And most of my talk is about these two methods and how oxygen can act as a proxy. So I went about, when I was asked to give this talk, I was like, okay, I'll talk about this. There must be tons of data where we have TOU and DOU. Turns out there are like less than 5 papers where both these things have been done together. There's a lot of paper which does DOU, even more paper that does TOU, but when you try to look at together, there are very few papers. And there is utility in doing these together. So I have examples from 3 areas, my backyard, Gulf of Mexico, and Congo and Rhone Delta. So what we can see, the first thing that we notice here, that depending on which delta data you are looking at, there's a wide range of TOU and DOU, right? And the blue here is the TOU, total oxygen consumption, and this is diffusive oxygen uptake, DOU, in orange. And the number on the top, that tells us the penetration of oxygen inside the sediment. So we can see for Congo, the oxygen penetration in these sediments are up to 70 millimeters. There's a huge oxic layer in there. Whereas somewhere in Gulf of Mexico, that oxygen penetration is 2 millimeters, which means there's a big anaerobic respiration that is happening immediately under the top thin layer. That's the first thing we can see. Big difference overall between these deltas. The second difference we see is DOU and TOU often doesn't match, right? And that difference can be big here, or it can be very small in some of these cases. But there is a difference between TOU and DOU. And why? So why is there a difference between TOU and DOU? Obviously, they are not measuring the same thing, so there should be difference. But that can tell us quite a bit. So one thing that comes out of this kind of analysis when I start looking at it is that it's very limited kind of data where both of these are done. But I think that it's important that they can be done together because they can provide us a lot of other information. So what I went about doing is, in that case, since there was not many of these simultaneous data sets, I went and looked at this really nice global oxygen consumption database that has been produced by Strutman et al. I think it is in Scientific Data. It's a data paper. And although we don't have coupled data, there are these data sets where people have measured TOU, and they often doesn't match. It's same study, they're different studies, but it just gives us some general idea. So what I did a pretty crude analysis here. I just took out the 10 to 200 meter data that is available from this data set. It goes all the way to 6,000 meters. Just to represent the shelf, I cut off the 10 meter, thinking some of these might be too estuarine for us. I didn't want to kind of extend the delta that far. And the first thing we can see, there's a difference in axis, factor of 3, 180 versus 60. So when you look at the trend, what we can see is TOU goes down, so does DOU. But the important factor to note here is TOU starts much higher and then kind of goes towards the value of DOU. And DOU starts a lot lower, but it gradually goes to that similar value. So what it is telling us that the difference between TOU and DOU is much, much bigger in the shallower water and is almost non-existent when we go into deeper water. Why is that? And I think we have Bob here. He has done a lot of work on biodiffusion and bioirrigation. The main factor that is driving that difference is the fauna-mediated organic matter consumption and the oxygen-mediated mediation in the sediment. And so by doing these two, we can actually look at these kind of processes and how they can impact carbon cycle. And we can also use this oxygen consumption as a kind of like a fast pass at how much organic matter we're really remineralizing at the seafloor in this deltaic system. So when I did that scaling, it turns out globally TOU remineralized approximately 2.8 petagram of carbon, out of which 70% is due to diffusive oxygen uptake. And when you just squeeze it to that top 200 meter, which I define as the shelf here, that's about 50%. And when I start doing a cumulative graph here, the difference is set right here between TOU and TOU. But in general, we can see in about 200 meter water depth, 50% of the organic matter that is totally consumed, totally used up by oxygen happens within that tiny zone across the shelf, making these areas very important. And we also saw in the previous slide that these DOU and TOU are really high in the deltaic systems, which means there is a disproportionate contribution from these deltaic adjacent sediment shelves towards this organic matter remineralization, which kind of makes sense because if you look at this really nice graph here, most of these young sediments that are out here are highly reactive. So their degradation time scale constants are lower, so it gets degraded faster. So that kind of makes sense. But the story doesn't end there, because when we talk about oxygen, we're leaving out a big chunk of the organic matter mineralization. But we're forgetting about the anaerobic respiration here, right? So how can we include that? If we really want to get a good picture of the remineralization, we need to include both of them. So oxygen, somewhat implicitly, actually accounts for some of that, which is what makes it a great tracer, because some of these reduced species, they get reoxidized at the oxygen boundary. So if you're measuring oxygen, you're kind of indirectly measuring some of these anaerobic respiration, but not all of them. So we can kind of start looking at all the other reactions. So we don't have to look at that, but what we can see here is the first line is aerobic respiration, everything else is anaerobic respiration, and we can see all of them contribute to DIC fluxes. So we can use DIC as a more comprehensive signature of organic matter fluxes that is happening in these sediments. One caveat there, if the sediments have a lot of calcium carbonate, that can also produce DIC, so we have to be careful to take that out. But if most of the deltaic system doesn't have that much carbonate, so we can kind of look at that as a direct proxy. So we start looking now in terms of oxygen and DIC flux coming out of these sediments. It tells us a slightly different story. You can see here, so the black is the DIC fluxes out of the sediment, and orange or light brown is our oxygen fluxes that is translated to DIC fluxes using Redfield ratio. And what we can see here that across these three different delta scales, roughly less than 50% of the organic matter remineralization that is happening is driven by oxygen. So, and we can see in some cases, only 10% is aerobic, 90% is anaerobic respiration. And so I just did a very simple back of the envelope just to show how important this can be to the carbon budget. And we can see here, I just did my favorite delta numbers, about 30 millimole of DIC per meter square per day, took it for 6 months, the same rate. With the minimum value, we can see that just the shallower shelf in the Mississippi Delta, it can flux out about 1.2 times 10 to the power 9 mole of carbon per year just from benthic respiration into the overlying shelf. And so we can start adding these up for other delta systems, and it's definitely a big number. So there has been some modeling aspects to this, and here is one of the really nice paper who tried to do this really interesting model to put forward how much organic matter is being remineralized as a function of DIC flux. The number is pretty big, about 70 teramole per year. However, and another important aspect there is most of this DIC flux, as you can see here, happens at really, really shallow water. What this shows is diffraction, and we can see about 50%, if we add this up, about 50% of that is happening at 25 meter or less. But one of the downside of this model is it may not be super applicable to many of these delta systems, because these delta systems not only are they're driven by this anaerobic respiration where sulfate reduction is the big factor. These delta systems, they also have a lot of iron and manganese coming into these systems. So they are really not same as every other shelf out there. So something future models needs to consider if we're trying to discriminate between delta dominated systems and regular shelves, we should probably look into the aspect of iron and manganese oxidation and how reduction and how they impact the organic matter remineralization. So here is a really nice paper by Owings that came out a couple of years back, which shows the importance of manganese and iron. I just wanted to point out that it's not just always sulfur reduction. There are these other processes that also needs to be incorporated if you're trying to build up these DIC flux models. So I'm going to kind of summarize this kind of bigger overview on global scale of what we kind of know so far about fluxes. So what we can see here is, of course, the oxygen measurement are really important. They can tell us a lot about organic matter remineralization in the water column, but the problem is often they're done in isolation. And more often than not, there's a lot more oxygen measurement in the water column than in the sediment. And we know for a fact, like in any hypoxia area around the globe, about 50% of the oxygen consumption happens in the sediment. For Gulf of Mexico, in the hypoxia of Louisiana Shelf, about 70% happens in the sediment, 30% in the water column. But this is all the data of sediment oxygen consumption from probably one of the most well-studied hypoxia area in the world. And if you look at the amount of water column data that is available, there's about 1 million-fold more, at least. But most of the models, when they're trying to go in and model the hypoxia, they need to rely on the sediment oxygen consumption to be able to do that model. And often people fall back on some kind of linear relationship. We can see right here, TOU versus bottom dissolved oxygen. If you just look at the overall data, there is a negative trend, right? The lower is the bottom oxygen, the less is the oxygen consumption, which kind of makes sense. But when you start looking at these individual data points and then try to come up with a single trend, there is none. So what would be the slope of the line if you want to use the bottom water concentration as a proxy for sediment oxygen consumption? The different models rely on different relationship between these two to translate these hypoxia models. But if we had these kind of coupled measurements, I think that would really help progress this modeling of these systems. Other important factor that I want to point out is the dynamic nature of these systems. And there is a really, my time up? Oh, okay. Okay, so I talked too slow, but I'll just go forward and just say about the dynamic processes, and they can really impact oxygen budget big time. And we just had this data that we did after Hurricane Harvey, where we found that one single hurricane can actually inject same amount of material as the entire Mississippi River Delta brings in a year. And what that impacts is can really change our fluxes. We can see from July to a hurricane, the increase in DIC fluxes in the bottom can go up by 5 times. And how does that impact the respiration? Because you're putting the sediments into the water column, you reduce the photosynthesis, increase the respiration, and that can have direct impact on our carbon cycle. So we can see because of this increased DIC flux and water column respiration, this area, which is usually a weak sink of CO2, turned out to be a source of CO2. There was 100 ppm increase in surface CO2 after these storms. And so they are all coupled. So my point here is we really should be sampling many of these transient processes and along with both water column and sediments so that we can understand the entire system and put them in the models. So I'll just leave it with that. And that's me seeing my lander breaking down as I was out there during one of those hurricanes. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. All right, I'll start. So global models tend to estimate a certain amount of carbon supply to the seafloor that you convert it to a sediment oxygen consumption is far less than what the TOU suggests. It's about half or less than half. Do you think that entire difference is made up by benthic consumption, benthic processes, anaerobic processes?
Probably not, but in the shallower water, I think that is a big factor. In the shallower water, it's benthic processes will be much more important than the deeper water. Yeah, but also, as I said, the nuances of TOU also needs to be looked at. Are we really, if we still use the same RPM to incubate our core in the shallow water versus deep water, we're kind of artificially increasing the oxygen consumption, or decreasing, depends on, so that's why I think context matters. Otherwise, we don't have any relation. We can have a lot of sediment oxygen consumption rates, but without context, they're not meaningful for models.
Hello, I saw that you said the sediment oxygen consumption rates and the bottom water oxygen were pretty decoupled, but if you had data on the amount of organic carbon in those sediments, could you use those two to predict the consumption rate?
What's the question?
If you had sediment organic carbon on the surface, and you had bottom water oxygen, could you then predict the oxygen consumption rate?
And actually, we have tried that, but it doesn't work very well because the organic matter is not the same. So in fact, there are a lot of relationships which try to do that, and more often than not, it's a scatter.
All right, thank you again. Oh, there's one. Oh, one more? Okay, sure. One more. Sorry.
Sorry, guys. I'm going to ask that question. You probably don't have the answer, but I'm hopeful anyways. I'm just wondering to what extent there is an understanding of the proportion of oxygen consumption coming from the bacterial community versus macrofauna. Is there a sense of these roles?
I don't know the answer, as you said, but yeah, but I would say I would imagine most of the apart from the top layer, most of the microbial communities anaerobic, right? But they can be switched around with this benthic bioirrigation. So indirectly, I think bioirrigation plays a big role in that process, but I really don't know how much each of them are.
All right, thank you again. Next up, we have Shaily Rahman from CU Boulder. Shaily is the real lead of this session, and Cristina and I twisted her arm to give this plenary, so thank you very much. She'll be speaking to us about biogeochemical cycling of silica and phosphorus in deltaic systems.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about silica cycling, mostly because I realize I tend to lose track of time when I start talking about silica. But anyways, I'm going to try and get to phosphorus too. And I feel like with the marginal C session, we should have a wave if silica happens to be our favorite macronutrient. So I'm going to start the wave and maybe see, okay, I see a couple of hands. That's great. I'm not going to go on to nitrate or nitrogen species and phosphate because I know that a lot of people are interested in that given the talks that we've had, the wonderful talks that we've had in the past couple of days. So I want to point your attention again to just how much primary productivity that you see along the coastlines that are connected to or influenced by deltas, where you see from here, as many people have talked about already, from the Amazon to the Orinoco. Here's the Mississippi Delta. You've got the Congo over here that looks like it's covered by a cloud. And then you've got the Bay of Bengal, and you can see just how high the levels of primary productivity are along the coast. But you know, at the same time, as Bob mentioned before, you have more than 50% of your marine carbon burial that also happens in these coastal systems. Now, just to pull you back to the carbon story here, because there's such, and my slide got turned. Oh, this is Google Drive. Okay, this is uploading and downloading. Uploading and downloading on Google Drive. Okay, so this should be net sediment accumulation rate. So in areas where the very high rates of net sediment accumulation, you also have lower rates of organic carbon preservation. But when you multiply the two together, you have really high rates of burial. So I just want you to kind of keep this image of the carbon cycle in mind, because I'm going to be talking about silica at the end with respect to the carbon cycle and how those two cycles are coupled and decoupled in deltas. And I hope my next slide is not turned. Yes. So, silica. So this is a silica world. This is a recent synthesis paper by Paul Traeger in 2021. And so the way that I'm going to be structuring my talk is I'm going to be talking to you about, giving you a little overview of what the cycles look like maybe in open ocean settings before then moving on to the coast here where a lot of other stuff is going on at the same time. So these are fluxes out of the global ocean. You've got fluxes in, rivers, submarine groundwater discharge, low temperature, mineral dissolution. This is an estimate, this is all in teramoles per year of primary production rates, export, your rain rate, and how much recycling or dissolution of biogenic silica happens in a marine sediment and then diffuses out into the water column. So we're just looking at the open ocean setting here. The canonical model of the behavior of silica in marine sediment is that once you actually form this diatom frustule and it sinks to the seabed, it'll either get buried and form chert over tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years, or part of the frustule will dissolve and diffuse back into the water column. In most open ocean sediment pore water profiles, these are pore water profiles from the Southern Ocean, support that view, where mostly you have dissolution in the top 20 centimeters. It reaches some asymptote or asymptotic value, and you have diffusion of dissolved silica out of sediment. Now, everywhere it's predicted in the seabed that these asymptotic values should reach about 1,000 to 1,200 micromolar, but I haven't actually seen a pore water profile in the open ocean that reaches that value unless you're working in and around mangroves. Makes them really cool, along with a bunch of other reasons. Okay, so that's open ocean. So now, what do these profiles look like once you get to deltas? So this is, these are some data unpublished from the topset, French Guiana. And you can see that this is the line, this dotted red line, is what you would predict if only biogenic silica dissolution was happening in your sediment column. And instead, what you see is pore water profiles that really don't look like what they look like or what you expect them to look like compared to open ocean pore water profiles. And that suggests that there's some net reaction that's happening. So you have dissolution of biogenic silica that's releasing dissolved silica into your pore water, and you must have some sort of consumption reaction that's sequestering that dissolved silica. So your fluxes out of the seabed are not as high or as expected. And this is typical of other deltaic systems. The Amazon Delta, the East China Sea, Mobile Mud Belt, the Congo Fan. So these are not atypical. Even when you use these benthic landers, this is some data that Kenshin shared with me. This is seasonal data, which is really unusual that you're getting seasonal data from a single location anyway. So, you know, I'm loving this data set already. But you can also see, I wanted to point out that depending on the season and the station, you also have a consumption, it seems like, of dissolved silica from the water column into the seabed. So I wanted to point out that pore water profiles and these fluxes, this coupling between the benthic layer and the water column are really different in deltaic systems. Why are they different? Well, if you pull out some of these frustules, take a look at it, you can see that they undergo diagenetic alteration. And instead, they're forming, what seems to be happening in a lot of deltas is that they're forming these metal-rich, amorphous luminosilicate phases at sediment water interfaces on the surface of these frustules. And these reactions sequester alkalinity, cations, anions, and trace elements. Indeed, this might be one of the only sinks for potassium in the ocean, which is probably why our potassium concentrations over the last 600,000 years have stayed pretty much the same. Where's that potassium going? Could be a reverse weathering reaction. So that's generally what this diagenetic alteration or this formation of this aluminosilicate phase is called, if it's happening at the sediment-water interface. So instead of this canonical model that you have in the open ocean for the sedimentary silica cycle, you have something a little bit more complicated in deltaic systems. So instead of, certainly some of it dissolves, and some of it does diffuse back into the water column, but a lot of it undergoes some sort of diagenetic alteration, and this is modified from Michaelopoulos and Aller, 2004. So it can form these metal oxide coatings. You can form these authogenic aluminosilicate phases. You can get infilling of pyrite in some of these frustules. And all of these reactions, or the suite of reactions, will take up dissolved silicon, potassium, magnesium, fluoride, iron, manganese, aluminum, lithium, germanium. And this is really important too if you are interested in using stable lithium isotopes, stable germanium isotopes to track weathering reactions, or the history of chemical versus physical weathering. And it's also really important to close the budgets of your stable silicon isotopes as well. So why do these reactions seem to happen in deltas? Well, you have that influx of nutrients. You saw that region of really high primary productivity. So you've got a supply of BSI, biogenic silica. But because of, and Bob showed this earlier in his talk too, they're really physically reworked regions. And most of the information I'm going to be giving you is from this top set region that Till also referred to as Till and Jaap referred to as the delta plane. And so because they're so physically reworked, they keep regenerating these reactants that are necessary for the formation of reverse weathering products, or promoting this diagenetic alteration of your biogenic frustule. So how do you quantify this? So if you're using just your traditional leach, typically biogenic silica contents are accessed by leaching sediment. So when you're quantifying this and they become coated with these metal oxide coatings, it's really hard to dissolve that initial frustule. So depending on the type of leach that you have, if you're using a traditional one or a modification to the traditional one, you can get estimates that vary by 5 to 10 times of what your actual BSI content is. So your traditional leach is the bar in red, which assumes that the frustule does not have a coating. And then there's a modification to this where you can remove that coating, or try to remove that coating, before you then try to dissolve that silica frustule. Now, if you use a radiometric or radionuclide tracer like silicon-32, you get estimates that are even higher. And it's interesting to see like 5 years of work reduced to just 2 bars on a graph, but this is 5 years of work reduced to just 2 bars on a graph. Yeah, we've all been there, right? We've all been there. So a single measurement can take up to a year. It can take you up to a year to get a single data point. However, just look at how, it's a radio tracer, it's hard to argue with the results. You've tagged your diatom frustule with silicon-32 naturally. And so if you can retrieve that activity in your sediment column, then you get a much more accurate estimate of how much biogenic silica is actually in there. So that's my plug for using silicon-32. Go out and buy a beta counter and do it, because we only have a few data points. Again, so these estimates are much, much higher once you actually use a radio tracer. So what does that mean? So again, in this canonical model, where we've been thinking about where is biogenic silica buried, typically it's assumed that it's in the Southern Ocean. And this is from Hayes et al., 2021. This is a percent opal content, where they've done a really nice summary and compilation of data. So you can see that in the Southern Ocean, The percent opal contents are pretty high. They're above 40%. Sometimes they're up to 80%. So the assumption is that that diatomaceous ooze belt in the Southern Ocean is the main sink of biogenic silica, the main sink of silica in the ocean. But once you start putting in the results from this radio tracer, you see that the Amazon Guyanus, which, these data points are not close to shore. All of these data points are below 1,000 meters water depth, or from below 1,000 meters water depth. So in the Amazon Guyanus, once you start getting closer to shore, you see that opal contents are anywhere from 12 to 24%. In the Indo-Pacific archipelago, similar, 12 to 24%. Then in the Mississippi Delta, it's 4 to 13%. So once you put all of those numbers together in terms of the budget, which for silica is and can be balanced at about 15 teramoles per year inputs and outputs, you see that the storage of biogenic silica in deltas alone accounts for 30% of your river inputs. And that's because they're really dynamic, they're physically reworked, because the rivers supply all of these nutrients. They also have a lot of primary productivity, so you have a lot of BSI being delivered to the sediment as well. And because of that reworking, they keep regenerating these nutrients. So you're kind of always resetting that sediment pile to release your reactants. So when we talk about carbon, these are thorium normalized fluxes. So these are silicon to carbon ratios from those data points. Recall that diatom silicon to carbon ratios are 0.1 to 0.2, and it's assumed that in the continental margin, your silicon to carbon ratios are 0.6, and you use these ratios to extract carbon burial from your biogenic silica contents. But again, when you start looking at deltas, and this is an assumption that sorry, let me go back. So in the Arctic Ocean, you can see that they are pretty low. They're closer to 0 to 1. And then in the Southern Ocean, the average is around 2 to 3. So the assumption is that in the open ocean, when these frustules have a little bit more time to sink, the silica and carbon cycles become decoupled because they have different rates of remineralization and respiration. And it's assumed that in continental margin sediments, because they don't spend very much time in the water column at all, and they settle out of the water column, that they are more tightly coupled, so that the numbers are closer to the 0.1 to 0.2 that you see in diatoms. But instead, in deltas, when you use these radio tracers to retrieve your BSI contents, you see that they're actually quite decoupled in deltaic systems as well. So in the Bay of Bengal, it's about 5. Gulf of Papua and the Amazon Delta, it's from 3 to 6. So you have these different remineralization pathways that other people have talked about earlier today, where you have almost complete burial of your biogenic silica that's delivered to sediment, but you also at the same time have almost not complete, but very rapid organic carbon incineration or respiration, and very little of that organic carbon that's delivered to sediment actually stays in that sediment pile. Globally, what this means, we put this in a global context with respect to like all that we know about silica burial now, today. Deltaic systems can account for 30% of your biogenic silica burial flux in the global ocean. And this is a conservative estimate because, as you've learned hopefully earlier today, we don't have good ideas of the areal extent or deposition rates in a lot of these systems. Like, we haven't constrained their sediment budget. So this is only from mostly like the top set proximal coastal zone, like down to 50 meters of water depth. So it doesn't include the foreset or the bottom set, deposition in the foreset or the bottom set. But 30%, that's a lot. Okay, I've got 4 minutes to switch to phosphorus. So an arrow, organic P to inorganic P. Okay. So this is from Ruttenberg et al. And I just want you to focus in the sediment layer. So what you have is swing switching. The amount that's actually delivered to sediment phosphorus, typically most of that is retained. It's just that you're switching from an organic phosphorus pool mostly to an inorganic or authogenic phosphorus pool. And you can see that in where open ocean profiles here, where you have organic, again, you see this sink switching or this buildup of this authogenic phosphorus precipitate, which are the open circles. And then you also have a profile here from the Mississippi Delta. Now, from the Gulf of Papua, we're able to do some of these extractions. And the average organic carbon to organic phosphorus ratio is about 150. And this is pretty typical for the Amazon Delta and for the Mississippi Delta as well. So just keep in mind what the marine ratio should be. So you've got this organic phosphorus pool that is being remineralized, and it's forming this authogenic phosphorus pool. Now, if you were to map phosphorus content versus sediment accumulation rate, you can see that this is on a log scale. Please be aware of the log scale. I just wanted to separate all of the different pools. You've got your open ocean settings, got some data from continental margins, and these are usually what have been tallied with by Ruttenberg et al., Filippelli et al., Wallman et al., et cetera. So I'm adding deltas to this data set. Here. And if you look at accumulation rate versus sedimentation rate, which should be related because you're multiplying P content by your sedimentation rate. But again, I just want you to see how they fall out and how much higher you should expect your phosphorus burial in deltas to be. So when you average these out, this is another way of looking at it, you can get up to 15 millimoles per square centimeter per kiloyear of phosphorus burial in deltas. And because there is a brevity of data, I was only able to really do this for the Amazon, Mississippi, and the Gulf of Papua. It's like 2% of your global phosphorus budget. Sink sources can be buried in just their 3 deltas alone. So that's just from the sediment accumulation rates that I had and the area of the delta top set. But I recently asked Jaap what the area, subaqueous area of deltas could be if he had some sort of estimate. This is, covers about 40,000 cubic square kilometers, and he thought that the number would be closer to 800,000 square kilometers. If you do that math, this comes out closer to about 30%. If this is typical, if we can get some more data points from these other deltas. So 30% of your reactive phosphorus pool could be buried in deltas. And so I'm going to leave you with this summary slide. Okay. Also the summer slide, because it's lovely weather outside. Okay. So what's the impact of deltas on global marine budgets? So I'm going to leave you with the summary slide. You can see what a big impact they have on the marine silica cycle. And I'm going to presume and make that, not assumption, but I'm going to say that they're going to have a pretty big impact on your marine phosphorus cycle as well. Okay. Thanks very much.
Questions for Shaily?
So I have a question about the global silica budget.
Mm-hmm.
When you apply your silica isotope to the marine sediment, your biogenic silica content has been quite scaled up. So when you apply, assuming that you apply to the almost the entire global sedimentary environment, your output rate is pretty much consistent with the input of silica from rivers and hydrothermal vent?
So I think you're talking about the, I'm not sure if I can pull up that slide. So your riverine input is about 8.2 teramoles per year, and your reverse weathering flux is, or total biogenic silica burial in the continental margins is going to be about 5 teramoles per year. So that would be the ratio. Yeah, but that 5, sorry, the 5 is just in, the 4.5 to 5 is just in deltas, and you have another 3 teramoles per year that are buried in continental margins. But you have a lot of other input fluxes too, like you said, from hydrothermal vents, and also low temperature mineral weathering. So a lot of that is like saw the sediment delivery and the amount of sediment that is being delivered to the ocean. Some of that is going to dissolve right away, estuarine mixing, and then some of it's going to settle out of the water column and will dissolve over the course of a year. So that 1.2 teramoles is that solution input flux as well. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question regarding the phosphates. So you show the plot of the biogenic, like reactive phosphate, but how do you know that what you measure in the sediment, if it's organic or inorganic, how will you know it was bioreactive and not something that was not?
So I'm using these standard leaches that, well, I didn't use SEDEX. I used Aspola et al., which was one of the bases of SEDEX. So it's a 6 normal hydrochloric acid leach that is, there have been a number of studies done to show that it dissolves iron that is associated with iron oxides, calcium carbonate, and apatite. And then I did a boiling aqua regia leach, extracted one from the other to get an estimate of organic peat, which others have done before and consistent with some of these other studies, but just to show you, like, there may be some in there, but if we can use at least some of the similar methods, we can compare between.
So, you know, I love radioisotopes, so I got to ask this. So, Si32 to silica ratio, it's like beryllium-7. It washes off from the atmosphere, right? So how variable in space and time that ratio is, and is there any fractionation during uptake by the atoms?
It doesn't, there's so little of silicon-32 that I'm not sure how sensitive the data actually is. There have only been 2 studies on its cosmogenic, like its production rate in the atmosphere, and the number of, it's only the geosex cruises that measured the silicon-32 to silicon ratio, which if program officers are here, we should go back and include that in geotraces. So the number of data points is less than 100. And in the surface ocean during geosex, that was just in the top 500 meters to 1,000 meters. So we don't have enough data. However, given its half-life, which is 140 years, I think if we could take some high-resolution vertical profiles, we may be able to add another radio tracer to our toolbox to maybe get a signature of certain water mass formations in that mesopelagic zone that's hard to parse out and can't be done with carbon-14 ages. There's not enough data. I think so. I think it will, because the second study that was mostly done in Germany showed differences in rainwater that was collected versus snow, but then you also have the latitudinal changes as well. So basically, I think we just need more. There's just not enough data.
All right, thank you again. And last but definitely not least, we have David Lagomasino from East Carolina University, and he'll be bringing us to the ecosystem, a mouthful of mangroves taking root in tropical deltas.
All right, a little change of pace here. I am going to be talking really about that vegetation on top. I like to say the sort of the icing on the cake here, and really focused on these mangrove ecosystems. And what's nice to see from all the different delta talks is what deltas kind of show up there. And so one of my favorites here is the Rufiji Delta, where we've done some work. A few things I just kind of want to point out. Here is this is looking at the last about 20 plus years of change within the Rufiji Delta, where you can see sort of the creation of new mid-channel bars, expansion along the coast. But I also want to point out some of the deforestation that's kind of happening. And so we've talked a bit about some of these implications throughout some of the talks, but I'm really going to be going into, I think, some of the, like, how we're seeing mangroves themselves change within these tropical deltas, and put that into context. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about these awesome forests that are out there along the coast. So who's been lucky enough to go into a mangrove forest, take some samples? Awesome. So you know that. And you know our own sort of remobilization of sediments that can happen. And so this is some work that, not in a delta system, but for those that have worked in that, know how that is, right? And so, you know, we do a lot of work understanding the structure of these, and structure and function of these different ecosystems. Thinking about, you know, the above ground components, right? The woody, the live biomass parts, as well as looking at, right, those sediments that are actually accumulating on the forest floor as well. And so, you know, I'll say this is, right, we know all these things about coastal wetlands, and then with these mangroves in particular, right, they do serve a bunch of these different ecosystem services that were kind of brought up earlier. A lot of that's supporting these coastal communities for timber and fuel, fisheries, tourism, protection, which I'll get into a little bit. And what I'll be talking a little bit more about today is sort of that carbon storage aspect of this. So when we look at these systems, right, there are these, again, these awesome delta systems that we've talked about, these awesome forests. But when we look here in the Sundarbans, right, in the Ganges, we are abutting, you know, these other areas that are providing subsistence for the world, right? When we think about, this is where rice is growing, this is where shrimp is growing, this is what's feeding the world, right? The bread baskets of the world are coming from these coastal areas. Much of that is actually happening in those delta systems. And so taking this back to the Rufiji, that first sort of animation I showed you, where we saw that sort of loss of that mangrove forest, this is what that looks like in the process, right? So this is a slash and burn that's going on. This is in the process to be converted into either rice or into salt pans. And so one of the things that the work that my group does and others are really kind of focused on this landscape to understand that value of not just the ecosystem, but what that ecosystem converts to, right? The commodities and the importance of those commodities. But one thing that we're trying to do is actually separate out, when we look at these ecosystems, how do we separate this type of loss versus something that comes from a natural process, like a cyclone? And here's just an example of, not the Delta, but one of my spots in Everglades National Park, looking at, you know, 5 years after Hurricane Irma, right? So how can we kind of tease out these different changes in the landscape? Because this has different implications for carbon storage, as well as that delivery to that coastal ocean. And so our work is pulling information from the long-term satellite records. So we've looked at millions of Landsat scenes around the world and identified where that change in these forests are actually happening. And it's not just identifying that change, it's identifying that driver of change. What was that particular thing that made it sort of actually be lost. And so here's just a few examples of what we have, understanding the difference between agriculture, so really the conversion of to rice. On the left there, the conversion to aquaculture, so lots of shrimp, conversion to shrimp ponds, and then within the Sunderbunds itself, just shoreline erosion. So actually sort of the retreat of that shoreline. But we can start to tease out these different processes, again, because that relates back to how much carbon may be lost, what's the change in sort of carbon sequestration within these different forests. And so we can start to put some additional numbers on that. And so we've done this at the global scale, and we've separated this out into sort of various drivers of change. And there's a number of things that sort of play a role, both on the natural and human sides of things that that contribute to these losses, where we have shoreline erosion, the conversion to commodities, extreme weather events, non-productive conversion, so thinking about putting a road in that's changing the hydrology, right, how that may impact that system because you essentially cut it off. And then as well as on the bottom, thinking about these multiple processes happening in tandem, where we have the conversion to shrimp ponds or rice, as well as shoreline erosion. And so we have that coastal squeeze going on, as you can see there in the Mekong. So when we scale this up, 60% of the loss in mangroves around the world since the 21st century have been caused by humans. Almost that direct impact is happening a lot in Southeast Asia, and I'll kind of highlight some of that in a little bit. But most of that's coming from that conversion, the conversion to shrimp, rice, as well as oil palm. What I really want to point to here is that of about 6,000 square kilometers of loss that we've seen in the 21st century, about 20% of that is occurring in delta systems alone. And so what I mean by understanding these particular drivers is we can start to relate what that carbon emission potential is. And so this is actually kind of thinking about how that transformation of carbon happens as we erode that shoreline, or we convert that system to a shrimp pond or a rice paddy, where we're cutting down those trees, we're disturbing the soils. Right? So we've done some work to understand what would be the atmospheric kind of constant contributions to that. And where we see a lot of it, again, this conversion happening, and the emissions in terms of CO2 coming from this are really happening within that area of Southeast Asia. Again, a lot of that's driven by, and I'll go into it shortly, is really just a few deltas within the region that are really have lost, thousands of kilometers squared of mangrove ecosystems. So this is in press right now, and we've actually taken this back even further. So we're looking at the last 50 years of change, particularly in three Southeast Asian countries, so Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia. And what we see from this sort of, in the case from 1975 to 1996, about 8,000, a little more than 8,000 square kilometers of mangroves were lost in just these three countries. And as you can see on the top right, much of this is happening in the Irrawaddy Delta, and where we see this sort of drastic loss of that ecosystem. And the largest losses are occurring, again, in those in delta systems. So thinking about the loss in the Irrawaddy, the Chowphyra, and within these sort of Rakhine Delta regions. And so this is a lot of that conversion, again, to commodities that are happening across. And this was just from 1975 to 1996. And so when we look at that distribution of mangroves, and this is where I want to highlight the importance of deltas in sort of harboring or allowing for mangrove forests to grow is that 40% of global mangroves occur within 84 river deltas. This is about twice as much as any other sort of coastal type. And so the role of preserving deltas is quite important, right? These are the sort of the remaining intact tracts of mangroves. There was a study done by Worthington et al. And folks out of Cambridge looking at the typology, and so we've mapped out the types of units, so whether that was deltas, lagoons, open coast, or estuaries. We find that there's these 18 of the largest deltas are essentially these large tracts of mangrove forest around the world. And the top 3 largest units contain about 12% of the mangroves in existence today. The top being the Niger Delta. And just one thing to highlight about that is that this is drastically changing because of oil extraction. And so we're seeing a lot have maybe 10,000 plus square kilometers of change that's just happened in the Niger Delta because of oil extraction. The deltaic coast of Brazil, and essentially the Sundarbans, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, right? So these are the largest intact sort of systems, and again, they make up 12% of mangroves worldwide. And so we've mapped this out, looking at these different units that you can see here on the bottom right, the deltaic, the estuary and lagoonal, open coast, and as well as we sort of mapped out the carbonate ecosystems. And this is just kind of showing you the distribution of these different coastal types around the world. And really just kind of highlighting the change within each of these different regions where, again, within sort of South America and Southeast Asia, we're seeing the sort of biggest changes in the distribution of mangrove ecosystems, essentially a loss of mangroves across these particular regions. About 11,000 of those kilometers really were lost within only 5 deltas. So I've kind of highlighted them here. These are all sort of recent, relatively recent losses. Again, a lot of this because of the conversion to commodities. You don't see too much on the deltaic coast of Brazil. We're zoomed out pretty far. A lot of the stuff that's happening here is erosional processes that were kind of talked about earlier as those sort of mud banks sort of move along shore. So there's a number of different factors that kind of influence how carbon is stored and allocated within these mangrove systems. We have, these coastal processes that we kind of talked about, right? The differences between wave energy, tidal regime, and river discharge, right? These things are interacting with these ecological processes and climate to change the way carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus interact within these particular regions and influence the structure and the function of that vegetation. And this impacts, again, sort of how nutrients are allocated both in the above ground, the living biomass, the tree part of the forest, as well as what happens below ground. Particularly when you think about the soil carbon, both the stuff that is accumulating from allochthonous sediment, but as well as what's actually being sort of deposited and integrated from fine roots within the mangroves themselves. We have to kind of think about this from a few different sort of levels, right? We have a global distribution, right? These boundaries of these mangrove systems, right? So they're driven primarily by air temperature, right? They don't like freezing temperatures, so we're kind of limited to the tropics and some of the subtropics. We start to look at these land-ocean controls. So looking at, again, these sort of geomorphic classifications, the role of tides, of river discharge, and then we start to look at more locally, thinking about how that water is actually connected within these particular systems. So it's the hydrology and topography within that particular region. And so that starts to split things out between how things might be riverine or fringe or basin or scrub. So this is how well water is actually moving through the system. And then we have these other sort of multi-gradient patterns that are driving how resources are used and can be used within the particular habitats. And all of this is driving that structure and productivity. So when we think about the structure, you're looking at 45-meter mangrove trees here in Gabon, maybe up to 50. And this is drastically different to some of the shorties that we have around the world, right? So we have these scrub mangroves and these really tall ones. And I just want to point out, I mean really tall, right? There's a person standing right there. And so there's a wide range of this productivity gradient that's driven a lot by the distribution of these different nutrients, and we'll get into that shortly. And so we've been able to sort of map out that distribution of mangrove structure globally using a number of different satellite data sets, including radar and spaceborne LiDAR, to actually see that distribution of, in this case, the above-ground biomass, or the above-ground carbon that's stored within these mangrove ecosystems. And here, just kind of giving some examples in the Gulf of Papua and in the Sundarbans, where we can actually see that distribution of canopy height. So, for instance, in the Sundarbans, we're going from about 30 on the east side of the Sundarbans to about 30 meters to about 2 meters or less on that western end. Right, so we really map out these sort of productivity gradients within the sort of land parts of these deltas themselves. And so when we put this in context, that mangrove biomass, right, the stuff that's stored in the living portions, is influenced by these sort of bottom-up sediment source and nutrient loads that are coming into the system. And so on the left-hand side, you're seeing sort of the distribution of sort of these geomorphological types and its mean above-ground biomass. So again, how much organic matter is being stored in the above ground. And on the right-hand side, you see sort of other coastal settings. So a number of folks are starting to look at that coastal setting as an important part that's driving productivity in the vegetation. When we start to look below ground, that soil carbon in deltas, sort of the density is relatively low compared to other particular units. When we look here on the right-hand side, those blue areas, those blue bars are delta systems, large and small delta systems. And as you move to the right, going more toward lagoonal and karstic systems. So in the sense of that soil carbon density in deltas is relatively low, but when we start to look at the burial rates, and we kind of mentioned that earlier, we look at how much is actually being buried in these delta systems. If you look all the way to the left, right, the delta systems are actually accumulating a lot more and faster because of the rapid rates of deposition that we're having. And so just to kind of point out where deltas are here. And so we have, again, that density is relatively low in deltas, but again, it accumulates quite quickly. So thinking about, right, the role of sediment input, nutrient loads, and then there's less fine root material. And so what we're seeing within delta systems themselves, and I've highlighted them there in the orange boxes, we start to have these interactions between soil, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And so when we have, these sort of relationships between what's happening with soil NNP and what that means for basal area. So how, so essentially the wood density, or sorry, the area of biomass stored above ground, but we start to have these relationships with fine root production. And so in delta systems, we have a low N to P ratio, and that means just less fine root production. And so they're putting more toward their above ground biomass and a little bit less toward, again, that sort of fine root production And then lastly here, the soil is, NP is positively related to that organic density. So we have a higher NDP ratio, we have a higher sort of organic density. So again, within delta systems themselves, they have a lower NDP ratio, and again, that's less fine root production and less carbon density. And so we have this sort of relationship where we can look at the productivity within the soils of these different regions. So recently, there had been sort of this missing carbon value within mangrove systems, and that there's been a sort of a reanalysis of the mangrove carbon budget. And what's been shown from that is that DOC and DIC export has been a major contribution, which was that sort of missing carbon piece in the budget. But that sort of represents about 41 to about 100% for DIC export from the world's tropical rivers are coming from these mangrove ecosystems. And here's just coming from Dittmar et al. In 2006, as well as Daniel Lange, sort of redoing this mangrove budget. So it's kind of showing the role of the export of carbon from these mangrove systems to, again, the coastal ocean. So I just kind of want to wrap things up and say, like, it is this vegetation on top of the deltas. They also have a sort of protective role. And so when we think about where people are living and the density of folks where they are at, right, mangroves help to protect land and protect money. And so there's a lot of cool, you'll hear some more a little bit later about some of the new sort of satellite data sets that are coming out. But when we think about SWOT, NISAR, ISET2, these are things that start to help us get at the structure, function of these particular ecosystems. And with that, I'll end with a nice sort of LiDAR image of canopy heights across the Zambezi Delta. Thank you.
Very impressive. Questions for David?
Hi, Tim DeVries, Santa Barbara. You presented some numbers of the CO2 equivalent emissions from, I think it was destruction of these ecosystems. Was that for what's happened or what's going to happen in the future? And what was the time span for that?
So that's out to 2100. And so with that, we had some numbers based off of looking at the different types of losses. So we sort of allocated sort of different coefficients based off of whether it was shoreline erosion, where we would sort of lose everything, or lose a little bit of the soil as well as the above ground biomass. Was it something that was just deforestation, where we're just losing the above ground biomass? And so that was like a projection going out to 2100. And the idea behind that is what we're also looking at, well, if we did certain things, right, if we limited sort of deforestation or sort of restored certain areas, what that sort of emissions rate would look like going out to the end of the century.
And what was the total number?
I can share that with you after. I don't know off the top of my head. Okay. Okay. Airs. Yeah. Truly, probably a bird that might be in it. Oh. Yeah.
I have a question for both Dave and Shaily. You talk about the global rivers, so there's the big rivers, right? So all small rivers are also considered. I'm asking because like some calculations I have done maybe 10 years ago show that small rivers combined, the carbon contribution could be 50% compared that with large rivers in the Gulf, like we talk about Mississippi and Atchafalaya.
So look, roughly the big tropical rivers supply about 50 to 56% of DSI. So that seems consistent then with what you're saying with summing the rest. Yeah, but roughly it's about 60% of the world's rivers are gauged and measured for dissolved nutrients, TDS, cations, etc.
Yeah, and what I'll say to that, George, is, I don't present anything that's related to sort of that export. I'm looking strictly at sort of the standing stock and carbon sequestration potential that's happening within that extent of forest itself. And so from that standpoint, those large deltas are what's containing most of the mangrove carbon, and where most of it's actually being lost because of human and natural causes.
Yep. Thanks. Great talk. I'm just curious about the expansion of mangrove forest into higher latitudes. In some areas, they're becoming sort of an invasive species, and well, they're taking over salt marshes and that kind of thing. So I'm wondering to what extent that expansion northward and southward is offsetting some of the losses that we're seeing.
So the expansion as we go poleward, and I'll even say sort of landward, is helping to offset some of those losses. And actually, we'll be presenting at there's a mangrove conference coming up next month, where we'll be showing some of the gains related to this. The one thing there is like, yes, it's helping offset some of the losses in extent, but most of that carbon is in the soil. And so it takes a long time for it to get there. So what's happening is you might be, expanding landward or poleward, but you still need, 40, 50 years to really get that soil there. So you're losing mature mangroves that are carbon dense and replacing that with that landward or poleward expansion, but at a lower carbon density. So it needs time to sort of grow and mature to actually offset in terms of carbon.
Okay, so question from online from Christopher Kenyon to panelists. I would be interested to know the diversity of microbial communities in the soil beneath the different height mangrove communities, and if there are certain species that are enriched differentially. Do you know if anyone has done any characterization of mangrove soil microbiomes?
So there has been a lot of work focused on microbial communities within mangroves, and I will leave it there as that, because that's not my background on it, but there is a lot of work that's going on to understand particularly that outward flux, the lateral flux of nutrients out from the microbial community.
Any other questions?
Maybe that this is going to be a natural continuation of the previous question. My question directly goes to Bob Eller. In the deltaic environment, the land-driven organic matters is very quickly oxidized back to CO2. It's a little bit, at least to me, is counterintuitive, because these organic matter has been survived through the freshwater aquatic environment. So as soon as they get into the near marine environment, how come the microbial community might be how come they efficiently utilize them rather than marine organic matter, because they've been seeing marine organic matter for throughout the whole the historical time. So very easy to oxidize organic matter, marine organic matter, rather than the terrestrial organic matters. Can you educate me in terms of the microbial activity?
Okay, it's possible that I gave the wrong impression, but the bulk of the carbon in the sedimentary pool is, at least in the systems that I've looked at, terrestrial origin. A small quantity is marine. However, that small quantity of marine is replenished constantly by entrainment in the sedimentary transport processes. That small quantity drives most of the respiration that you see. So it's a very small quantity, but it undergoes a very rapid and high turnover rate. So when you look, for example, at the DIC pools in sediments or in the fluxes from sediments, it is supported by marine carbon, even though it's a minor component. At each point of the process, a small amount of the terrestrial carbon is remineralized, but it's very difficult to see that, what its contribution is. But if you wait long enough, that small amount integrated over a long time in the systems that I've looked at is eliminated or greatly burned down. So there is a case where that I showed a picture of, for example, in South America, where the mud banks, where the mangroves are destroyed constantly, and it's kind of a steady state system there, where you build on one side, a road on another side, and so the forests are growing on one side and being eliminated and destroyed on the sort of upstream side where they're eroded, and that material is rapidly remineralized. That's very young material. And so the age of the carbon pool, if it's young terrestrial carbon, it will be rapidly remineralized, mangrove leaves and even the trunk material. But if it's older carbon, terrestrial carbon, from land that's thousands of years old and it's already been sitting around for a while, the gong went off already, that material is pretty refractory. And it just takes a long time. It takes hundreds of years to get rid of it. But you can get rid of it. Keep exposing it to oxygen. This is where sedimentary dynamics and bioturbation come in. Both those processes inject oxygen into the system. One in a three-dimensional matter, that's bioturbation, and relatively slowly, but still it accumulates. And the other massively, the physical reworking. And that's, that reoxidation is critical. So that's why sedimentary dynamics trumps sediment accumulation every time. I hope that was clearer.
Comment and a question. So a quick comment in response to the question about microbes in the mangrove system. I just wanted to point out that there is an international mangrove microbiome initiative that's trying to aggregate all of the really wonderful data that's emerging on that particular problem. So anybody who's interested in that, if you look that up, the group's been pretty quiet over the last couple of years, but there's a lot of good information there, so that will help you get to some of that information. And then a follow-on question to the last one. So a lot of money has gone into preserving mangroves as a means of carbon stocks. And I'm a little confused now on the soil organic carbon longevity within the mangrove system after the different talks today, and I was hoping you could help me understand whether, I mean, that's obviously a very controversial strategy anyways, but are mangrove forests less good at storing carbon in the sediment than was traditionally thought? Is it seeming like that's turnover is more rapid of that carbon?
So I'll speak to this because there is a lot of space that's opening up within, I'll say, sort of CDR and blue carbon. I would say in these rapidly changing, like these mud banks, right, that's not a good place to do a project, right? Because that's a rapid turnover. I think when they look at some of these particular areas and identifying viability is understanding the content of that, because those areas outside of deltas are quite dense, and they do store a lot, and that's where Particularly, they're focused on some it's sort of reforestation and restoration of the area, but a lot of it is just keep it from being deforested. So I would say that it is a controversial topic there, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to actually make sure it's quantified and verified, because it needs to be, a long-term solution. And so something that's going to be eroded in the next 20, 30 years is not a good spot to actually set up a carbon removal project.
Hi, Graham McGilchrist, St. Andrews. I'll ask maybe a repeat or a corollary to the question I asked Jaap earlier, and maybe address it to the other members of the panel. From a global modeling perspective, from global biogeochemical modeling perspective, you want to be able to describe the system from large-scale parameters and the effect of the system from the large-scale parameters. How far away is the delta community from really being able to categorize or classify deltaic systems and their key driving components, if you're interested, for example, in the flux of nutrients or some other component between the open ocean and the land interface?
I was trying to avoid this one. So I think we've gotten to be pretty good at knowing what's flowing into deltas from the river, from compilations, and from modeling as well. But then the ocean side is a lot more messy. So I would say we need a lot more data sets, like around river mouth or just upstream of river mouth and in the ocean, to see what's flowing in and out. Yes.
Sorry, I don't want to hog the microphone, but I guess I'm just wondering, what am I wondering? Many things. Obviously, you always want more observations, but do we have any grasp on the fundamentally controlling parameters on the exchange between the open ocean and the riverine basin, and how deltaic sediments and processes operating in those areas influence those things? Like, if I had to put a parameterization of a deltaic exchange into a global ocean model, what do I care about? Is it just a diffusive flux? Presumably the answer is no. Or do I need to have more of a nuanced take on how to mediate that exchange between the land and the ocean?
Well, I can offer at least a couple of things here. One of the things that you would parameterize, going back to the morphology and the kinds of the statistical distributions of morphologies that were covered earlier, I think coupling that with the shoreward flow of seawater toward the system and the buoyancy flux involved with the river input would be the primary parameters that I would look at. So the expression of that shoreward flow will be dictated by the morphological distribution. And I think statistically you can do that. So that's the way I would approach it. I want to keep emphasizing there's this shoreward flow and upwelling associated with these large river systems has been badly ignored. I just don't know why people seem to be resistant to thinking about it. But as I showed in my talk, there are tools that we have to integrate it. So you don't have to instrument every place, for example, to quantify it. You can go to the sediments. It stores a record of what's coming from the ocean toward the rivers, and that's in radionuclides like lead-210. And we need to do a better job of using those existing tools that we have to answer that question. But that's what I would look to model this issue on a global scale.
So maybe in addition, for me, the key player probably is precipitation. Precipitation over the catchment areas, but also over the entire region. So if you're interested in influx and outflux, so the communication between the river and the ocean is, of course, about the gradient. And the regional precipitation controls the gradient regarding either a steeper gradient because more discharge, or a weaker gradient because of less discharge. Of course, precipitation also controls the ocean height very much, as I've shown. So I think if you're interested in a physical parameter, then it's about the volume of water going down the hills.
I can add to it too. I really liked Jaap's last slide that was making the point that we're not just looking at rivers going into oceans, but that deltas are unique environments themselves with a lot going on. And so with that idea, there's also work in the soil sciences community looking at, well, using machine learning and satellites to try to predict different processes that are happening within the shallow substrate. And I think applying that kind of knowledge to deltas will be really useful as well for looking at fluxes of different things like you're interested.
And you guys, oh yeah, I can hear myself. I'm really glad that Graham asked that question about like what are the relevant variables that we need to include in models, because I have to admit that I'm a scientist that really likes organisms, multicellular organisms, plants and animals. And I grew up with this story that vegetation in deltas was like a really important aspect of these environments that created like physical features, right, of like how they trap sediments and everything. And going back to this session that were there, like the early sessions when we were, a lot of people here were talking about if biodiversity matters, right? Would you consider like the types of vegetation, the species that live in these systems, an important variable to consider when considering fluxes between like land and ocean?
So, I mean, I guess how I see it, I'm definitely on that vegetation side of things. And so a lot of what we've been trying to do is understand that change, because I feel like the updated maps aren't necessarily in new models. And we're seeing that from other, I would say this might not necessarily be for sort of output lateral fluxes, but thinking about those land cover changes, having up-to-date information is going to be able to tell you about what's actually being stored and what's being released and how much potentially. I mean, that's where some of our sort of carbon emissions data sets were coming from. I think in thinking about, I think Jaap sort of mentioned the trapping of sediment, right? So the extent of, you know, your different vegetation, how well it's trapping sediment will definitely have an input, at least on that upper end, right? But knowing that, I mean, offshore is where most of, I think, the magic is kind of happening as well, right, below the water line. And so, I mean, I would say, yes, vegetation is definitely an important part, but, you know, even myself learning from folks today, you know, thinking about what, you know, a lot of that stuff is offshore.
I want to comment about the diversity issue in this regard, that in my experience, when mangroves become established, and this is not just my experience, but it's pretty obvious that other organisms come in, colonize at the same time, and in particular, brachyuran crabs are very, very common in these systems. And they come in and they create networks of burrow galleries in association with the mangroves. And you can view them, some people call them keystone species in these systems, but you could also view them as a very mutualistic interaction between the crabs and the mangroves. And so the crabs are part of the whole community or ecosystem diversity, and they certainly make it possible for the mangroves to grow faster, to be less affected by things like transpiration in the root zone, which creates highly saline pore fluids, and that can inhibit the mangroves. So there's there's quite a network of interaction. So I would say in these systems that the diversity of the community there, beyond the plants, is very critical for their ability to store carbon.
I would like to add that it certainly also depends on the local topographic differentiation. I mean, a Burford Delta only has 2 levees, let's say. If you go into a wave-dominated delta, you get successions of beach ridges, for instance, defining internal depressions, internal basins. If you go into really big deltas with a lot of accumulation, like from the beginning of the Holocene or something like that, you get a lot of subsidence, particularly at the inner part of the delta, so that suddenly the inner part of the delta is much lower than the outer part. I think that really determines the diversity in vegetation, but also the capacity of sediment retention.
I have a question. Thinking about another realm of global change and the ice, so maybe for Brandy. So we talked about sea level rise, and then Jaap mentioned a little bit about sea ice. But are there effects from melting glaciers and sea level rise that kind of interact to change deltas in high latitudes?
Yes, most of the systems that I've been focused on in Greenland are, so they're in Southwest Greenland. They have a lot of sediment that's being transported to these systems due to glacial mass loss. But there's actually a larger signal of isostatic rebound for those systems. So while they're growing, they're also being kind of raised up. So these high latitude systems that I'm looking at are not necessarily experiencing negative impacts from sea level rise that far north. Yeah.
Thanks. Brandy?
My question is for Kanchan or maybe Shaily. I was thinking about if there's any other processes we could be missing in terms of organic carbon storage. And I was wondering, Shaily, with what you were referring to with the silica and phosphorus, does any of that affect the organic carbon that's stored as well? You know, like, does that kind of layer with the reverse weathering that you were talking about? Does it impact organic carbon also? Maybe Kanchan can answer first.
Okay. I wasn't really looking at organic carbon storage at the same time. But I think that when diatoms die, they lose their organic matter coating pretty rapidly. And then the interior, Bob's going to correct me, can become filled with pyrite or aluminosilicate. So I think that that internal matter and the outer organic carbon layer is used up pretty fast. So I was really looking at the processes as different and instead taking whatever other organic carbon measurements might have been done in the same area. So it's more like a bulk characterization of the sediment. Yeah, so I wasn't looking at specifically at them at the same time.
I'll add to that surface area mineral. That's an important factor. And there's a, I think, 5-year-old paper in Nature showing the interaction between reactive iron and organic matter preservation. It's counterintuitive, but there's certainly a correlation between those two. I don't know if that's a causation, but there's things like that that definitely impact organic matter preservation.
Hi, I also have a question for Kansha. So you were talking about using DIC as a parameter to quantify the mineralized process happening at the non-carbonate shelves. How universal are those non-carbonate shelves? I remember, maybe David can speak to this, the Everglades, there is a huge layer of carbonate rocks. So I was wondering, yeah, how universal are these non-carbonate shelves for a coastal ecosystem, and how should we differentiate the carbonate dissolution process and the anaerobic process?
Right. So I kind of separated it for non-carbonate because most deltaic systems usually are non-carbonate. So that's why. But there are ways you can differentiate DIC dissolution from calcium carbonate. It has a very different delc-13 DIC value compared to delc-13 of marine organic matter. So positive 2, 3 versus negative 20, 30 we are talking about. So there's a range. So we can do a mass balance to figure out that differentiation in calcium carbonate dissolution and organic matter. That answer?
Okay, so I have a more specific question for Shaily, but I want to put it in a broader context, so that way maybe it's more interesting for everybody. For the silicon cycle that you're talking about, well, it's very nicely presented. I'm convinced that delta estuary plays a very important role. But in my very simple mind, I tend to think of these elemental cycles, including carbon cycle, as like inputs and outputs to the ocean and out of the ocean. So can you clarify a little bit about, like, yes, there are big flux, but in terms of like the number, like the budget, the input and output, what exactly are the role of these delta and estuary systems are playing? And in a broader context, for silicon, for other elements, and for carbon, I guess you guys are already answering that, but I want to press you a little more. Given these newer, like your study and insights, how do we view these systems in biogeochemical cycle? Like, what are the newer role that we're realizing them that they are playing in the global biogeochemical cycles?
Well, that was one of the reasons for convening this session specifically. But if you're talking to get back to your first question, so the marine silica budget now seems like you can balance it at about 50 teramoles input and output into and out of the ocean. And that burial in the delta accounts for about 4.5 teramoles of that. So that is a burial flux, that is an output flux. So, one of my motivations for starting to think about this is, well, what happens with sea level rise or retreat when you don't have these big deltaic features anymore? How does that cycle change? Because, I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the literature now, reactions that have to do with silica, whether it's weathering, reverse weathering, or what have you, are thought to control CO2 over long time scales, and they are being modeled using these global models. But if your supply of reactants becomes decoupled, you're not actually supplying all the dissolved iron or aluminum and biogenic silica in the same location, and also mixing them up so that they can just keep reacting, you may not have as large of a reverse weathering sink in another ocean state, say if you have like at a glacial maximum. So that's also going to impact all of your other tools that you might use, like your stable lithium isotope record or your stable silicon isotope record in your pores. But I don't think that it's considered that having a feature like a delta will have a 2 per mil fractionation effect, not because it's directly fractionating that that isotope ratio, but rather that just by its very presence and the impact that it has on storage and cycling, that it will perhaps change your record in a way that you're not considering. I don't know if that's it's something to ruminate on.
Okay, well, thank you to all the panelists and presenters today and for your attention.